30 spirit creatures rejected Lynn. For one reason, he was broke. Then his Hearthstone birthmark opened a tavern no summoner knew. Inside, real gold could buy Hearthstone minions as living summons. His first gamble produced a tiny Twilight whelp with death rattle. That baby dragon succeeded where every native spirit refused him. 1 week later, the tavern demanded more gold for upgrades. A farmer's son now needed adventurer money before the reset. That deadline pulled him toward monsters, nobles, cultists, and revenge. The disaster started in the spirit realm, where Lynn offered another contract to a succubus named Ashera. Gray fog covered everything while colored beams cut through the empty sky, but Ashera barely studied the terms. She tore the contract apart because her upkeep required dark essence Lynn could never afford. His family owned only 3 acres and a fragile wooden house, earning roughly 50 silver coins in an entire year. Ashera still found him ridiculously attractive, and her heart-shaped eyes made that part painfully obvious. She even offered him private company as consolation, because apparently poverty canceled contracts but not attraction. Lynn declined before her tail could get any closer, and returned home with rejection number 30. A slime had rejected him, an ogre had rejected him, and even a moon rabbit had judged his finances unacceptable. 10 days earlier, that outcome would have sounded impossible, because Lynn had awakened one of the town's rarest classes. He was a reincarnator from Earth, where his previous life had revolved around streaming Hearthstone at a professional level. Death had dropped him into this world before birth, giving him 16 years to prepare for its class awakening system. Children received divine occupations according to the lives they built before 16, while most people ended up with ordinary work classes. Both of Lynn's parents were level 5 farmers, each blessed with modest bonuses that made crops grow better or faster. Lynn wanted supernatural power instead, so he trained obsessively from childhood and studied every book he could find. He even attended church with perfect discipline, despite privately carrying none of the faith he pretended to possess. The priest saw devotion. Lynn saw another possible variable that might influence the future awakening. Lynn's preparation had started before he was old enough to understand half the books he collected. At 5, he was already doing push-ups, because every repeated action felt like a possible signal to the future class system. As he grew, those routines expanded into long runs around the family farm until the dirt path became more familiar than the road to town. He treated strength, endurance, study, and public reputation as separate investments, because nobody could explain exactly how awakenings were judged. That uncertainty made him over-prepare for everything. If exercise mattered, he exercised. If knowledge mattered, he studied. If community behavior mattered, he showed up wherever adults expected a responsible child to appear. The weekly church visits were part of that strategy. Lynn had been an atheist on Earth, but he listened to sermons, volunteered when useful, and behaved like the priest's dream student. The priest interpreted the consistency as sincere devotion and became genuinely proud of him. Lynn felt guilty enough to notice the irony, but not guilty enough to stop before awakening day. The numbers around him justified the obsession. Most people received ordinary occupations that strengthened the work they were already doing, rather than opening supernatural combat paths. A farmer could become better at farming without ever throwing a fireball. A craftsman could gain efficiency without ever surviving a monster attack. Lynn loved his parents, but watching their blessings improve crops had convinced him that he wanted a life beyond the same 3 acres. The hidden summoner class seemed like proof that 16 years of planning had beaten the odds. That was why the first rejection hurt more than simple embarrassment. The second made him nervous. By the 10th, he understood money was not a minor inconvenience, but part of the class's core operating cost. By the 30th, the rare awakening felt almost crueler than receiving an ordinary farmer class. Every spirit creature judged not only his potential, but whether he could maintain the contract after signing. A summon that starved, weakened, or lost required resources was a liability to both sides. Lynn could not even argue that the spirits were irrational. He simply hated that a hidden class had been placed in the hands of the one family least able to finance it. That mismatch created the desperation that made a glowing birthmark worth investigating, instead of dismissing as another strange fantasy phenomenon. The mark also carried emotional weight no local person could understand. It was not shaped like a random rune from this world. It looked like the symbol of the game that had once paid Lynn's bills, defined his reputation, and occupied years of his first life. Seeing it finally react felt like Earth reaching through 16 years of silence. For the first time since reincarnation, something from his old identity appeared to be reaching back. On his 16th birthday, all that effort appeared rewarded. When he awakened as a hidden class summoner, for several glorious minutes, he believed his fantasy adventure had finally started. Then reality explained the problem. a summoner without a contracted creature, was weaker than his farming parents. His only skill, spirit realm communication, merely allowed him to personally visit creatures wealthy summoners could actually maintain. Native summons wanted food, rare materials, training resources, or contracts backed by money Lynn did not have. An older adventurer named Dio had warned that poor people simply did not become successful summoners. Lynn had dismissed the comment as cynical until 30 separate magical creatures proved the old man correct. After returning from Ashera's rejection, he punched his wooden bed and discovered the bed was tougher than his hand. That humiliation might have continued all day if the strange mark on his palm had not suddenly begun heating up. The mark resembled the Hearthstone emblem from Earth, yet it had remained useless throughout his entire second life. Before Lynn could investigate, his parents told him Emily was waiting outside and had been worried about him. Emily had known him since childhood, and 10 days of isolation after his awakening had finally pushed her to visit. She arrived with blue hair moving in the autumn wind and immediately asked whether he was actually all right. Lynn gave the standard answer people use when everything is obviously terrible and claimed he was fine. Emily brought better news from her own awakening. She had received the actuary class and joined the Adventurers Guild as a receptionist. That stable position sounded almost luxurious beside Lynn's hidden class that currently produced nothing except rejection. He congratulated her, teased her about becoming the guild's pretty new receptionist, and earned a flustered punch to the chest. Then Emily suggested the one activity capable of restoring his mood, their homemade version of Hearthstone. This world had almost no entertainment Lynn enjoyed, so years earlier he had recreated the card game with carved wooden pieces. Emily chose priest, Lynn chose mage, and for a little while the failed summoner became the tavern king again. He won with a final fire spell, enjoying the first uncomplicated satisfaction he had felt since awakening. After the match, Emily revealed that years of calculating card values had directly shaped her actuary awakening. Lynn's improvised game from Earth had accidentally trained his best friend into a real profession. Emily warned that her new class also sharpened mental calculation, meaning she was rapidly catching up to him at his own game. That possibility offended the former professional more deeply than 30 spirit realm rejections had managed. Before leaving, Emily pushed a handmade plush into his arms and fled before he could react properly. It was her stitched interpretation of Deathwing, assembled only from Lynn's descriptions of the famous black dragon. The result looked more adorable than apocalyptic, with red ring eyes and uneven lettering across the wings. That night, Lynn held the ridiculous plush, while the Hearthstone mark on his palm became painfully hot. Blue light erupted from the symbol, and a crushing wave of exhaustion knocked him unconscious before he could stand. He awoke inside a dreamlike wasteland and found himself walking until every muscle begged him to collapse. Just as his endurance failed, a small cabin appeared ahead, with warm orange light leaking through the windows. Lynn entered for shelter and froze when he saw the bald bartender polishing a mug behind the counter. The man's face, voice, vest, and permanent smile were impossible to mistake. It was Bob, the bartender from Hearthstone Battlegrounds, standing in front of Lynn as though this were completely normal. In his previous life, Lynn had been known as the Tavern King because Battlegrounds was where his streaming career peaked. He had spent more hours staring at Bob's shop than he cared to admit, yet no dream should have felt this precise. Bob seemed surprised Lynn knew his name, then casually asked what the visiting adventurer needed. Desperation answered before logic could intervene, and Lynn asked whether the tavern had minions available for recruitment. Bob placed 4 cards on the counter and gave him 3 coins as a welcome gift. The first option was Wrath Weaver, a demon that grew stronger around other demons while damaging its own controller. Real-world self-damage sounded much less entertaining than game damage, so Lynn immediately rejected that gamble. Next came a Riverway Bouncer Fish, weak in direct combat but able to produce another random 1-star minion when sold. The third recruit was Gold Grubber, a safer pirate whose battle cry would make her significantly stronger the moment she appeared. The final option was Fortify, a 1-coin tavern spell that granted extra health and taunt to a minion. Any cautious beginner would have purchased the reliable fighter, but Lynn had spent years building wins from high-risk economy lines. He bought the Bouncer Fish for all 3 coins, then sold it immediately and recovered 1 coin. Its effect triggered exactly as the game would, producing a random 1-star minion in his hand. The new card showed a lazy purple baby dragon resting inside a cracked eggshell, Twilight Whelp. Its printed body looked pathetic, but Lynn knew the important line was the death rattle. Once killed, the whelp summoned a stronger dragon that immediately attacked, packing far more value than its tiny stat suggested. Lynn used his final coin on Fortify, giving the baby additional health and forcing enemies to target it first. For a Battlegrounds opening, the combination was absurdly efficient, and his old competitive instincts recognized the high roll instantly. Bob's presence was more than nostalgia, because Lynn knew the exact logic of the shop he represented. Battlegrounds rewarded players who treated weak pieces as temporary resources rather than becoming emotionally attached to whatever appeared first. A small economy advantage in round 1 could become a board-defining advantage several turns later. That thinking was why Gold Grubber, despite being the obvious immediate fighter, did not automatically win Lynn's choice. Wrathweaver also offered long-term scaling, but its self-damage clause became terrifying. Once pain and death were no longer abstract health points. The Bouncer Fish, by contrast, converted certainty into possibility. Buying it meant accepting a weak body now in exchange for another role at the recruit pool after the sale. Lynn had built a streaming career around recognizing when that kind of gamble was mathematically justified. 3 free coins also meant he could attempt the fish line without risking real money yet. The moment the new minion appeared, he recognized Twilight Whelp before finishing the card text. As a 1-star body, the baby looked weak enough that a beginner might dismiss it. Lynn saw this effective total hidden across 2 bodies instead. The whelp could absorb attacks, die, and still leave a larger dragon behind to continue the fight. Fortify improved exactly the part of that chain most useful in reality. Extra health kept the first body active longer. Taunt guaranteed hostile attention reached the disposable summon before reaching Lynn. Then Death transformed defense into a fresh attacker. It was the kind of layered value that looked clever on a game board, and borderline unfair when converted into physical combat. Lynn also noticed that Bob never asked whether a human from another world should possess these cards. The bartender treated him exactly like an ordinary customer. That normality was almost more unsettling than the dream itself. If Bob recognized some larger system behind the birthmark, he offered no explanation. If the tavern existed because of Lynn's past life, nobody confirmed it. All he received was access to the familiar rules, and enough evidence to know those rules now mattered to survival. That uncertainty did not reduce Lynn's excitement. For a former professional player, an unexplained system was still a system that could be tested. The first experiment would be whether a card could leave the dream. The second would be whether printed mechanics survived the transition. The third would be whether Warcraft lore existed beyond the simplified text. Twilight Whelp answered all 3 within the next morning. Then Bob, the tavern, and the cards vanished before Lynn could ask what any of it meant. Morning sunlight hit his face in the same wooden room, making the entire encounter seem like an unusually detailed dream. That explanation lasted until Lynn sensed 2 distinct cards floating inside his consciousness. The Hearthstone mark, Bob's tavern, and the purchases had followed him back into the waking world. After 30 native spirits rejected him, Lynn had finally received an advantage that did not care about his family income. He focused on the Twilight Whelp card and issued a summon command. White light filled the room, and the same purple baby dragon appeared on its eggshell directly in front of him. A detailed status panel formed above her, showing low physical attributes but unexpectedly high charisma. Lynn checked his own panel next and finally saw the result of 16 years spent training his body. His strength, constitution, and agility all sat slightly above an ordinary adult baseline, while his spirit reached 3. Then he reached charisma and stared in disbelief at a value of 20. A normal person measured around 1, meaning Lynn's appearance was absurdly beyond ordinary even by supernatural standards. That explained Ashera's reaction, but it also made 30 financial rejections feel even more insulting. Apparently, the spirit realm could look at a face worth 20 charisma and still choose a better bank account. Lynn stopped caring the moment he looked back at his dragon, because she demanded no food and no expensive essence. He activated Fortify, and a spectral shield wrapped around the whelp while her constitution rose sharply. More importantly, she gained Taunt, forcing hostile attacks aimed at Lynn to redirect toward her first. In a card game, Taunt was board control. In reality, it was life insurance. For the son of 2 farmers who worried about every monster outside town, that defensive rule was priceless. A new notification then informed Lynn that his next tavern visit would occur 7 days later. The coin limit would rise to 4, but future coins had to be purchased with actual gold from this world. That condition transformed his celebration into a financial emergency almost immediately. 4 gold coins equaled 400 silver, an amount his farming household could never produce within a week. Lynn also knew the second tavern round was the ideal moment to upgrade and unlock higher-tier recruits. Staying at the lowest tier would waste the strongest advantage he had ever received. So the new plan became brutally simple. Register as an adventurer, earn 4 gold before the reset, and stay alive. He packed quickly, left his parents working in the fields, and ran toward Maple Leaf Town's Adventurers Guild. Autumn leaves filled the streets, but Lynn barely noticed the scenery while mentally converting every future monster into tavern money. The guild building advertised every combat profession with an oversized weapon display, except the famously offended rogue class. According to local gossip, rogues had responded by creating their own shadow guild after being left off the building. Beside the guild stood the expensive Starfruit Tavern, a place Lynn had never entered because poor people avoided luxury by instinct. His entire available cash amounted to 2 silver coins, exactly enough for the adventurer registration fee. The guild interior was packed with armored fighters, mages, weapons, shouting, and enough activity to make Lynn feel conspicuously new. Then a rough voice announced his arrival, loudly enough for half the building to turn. Dio recognized Maple Leaf Town's first summoner and immediately started teasing the young man about finally finding a creature. The veteran was tiny, bearded, loud, and famous for an old story involving part of a dead white dragon. That ridiculous trophy had somehow become the foundation of Dio's nickname and personal legend for decades. He was also the same adventurer who had told Lynn that poor summoners had no future. Lynn ignored the insult and used exaggerated politeness to ask where a new adventurer should register. Dio assumed the hidden summon was probably a slime or goblin and laughed while escorting him to the proper counter. Lynn did not correct the misunderstanding because secrecy already seemed safer than explaining a Warcraft dragon. At registration, a bespectacled clerk named Pierre requested Lynn's class and the 2 silver fee with professional indifference. Only after the coins hit the counter did Pierre mention a new rule specifically affecting summoners. Registration now required a summon with combat power above 5, rather than merely proof that a contract existed. Dio immediately resumed laughing about whether Lynn's imaginary goblin could even reach the minimum. Pierre led Lynn into a private testing room containing a crystal sphere that measured a summon through direct contact. Once the door was locked, Lynn called out the Twilight Whelp and placed her paws against the crystal. The value climbed to 15 before the whelp's death rattle presence began affecting the reading. A larger draconic shadow appeared behind the baby, and the crystal surged until the final combat score stopped at 45. Lynn dismissed the summon, reopened the door, and asked Pierre with deliberate innocence whether he had passed. The clerk saw the result and lost every trace of his earlier boredom. A combat power of 45 from a brand new summoner was not merely acceptable. It was wildly outside Pierre's expectation. Within seconds, the same bureaucrat who had demanded payment without warmth was offering personal contacts and respectful titles. Lynn found the sudden improvement in customer service extremely educational. Pierre explained that adventurers also selected a personal title for their official badge. Lynn spent only a moment deciding and chose Hearthstone, carrying the name of his old world directly into his new profession. A bronze badge soon rested in his hand with that title engraved across the metal. For the first time since awakening, the summoner class felt less like a cruel joke and more like a real beginning. Dio remained convinced a goblin had somehow barely passed because Pierre refused to explain what he had actually witnessed. The clerk's expression toward Dio became wonderfully condescending, but Lynn let the misunderstanding survive. He followed the directions toward the quest hall and found an enormous board packed with work from across the region. Before he could study it, Emily recognized him from behind the reception desk. Lynn proudly displayed his new badge, expecting his childhood friend to celebrate the breakthrough with him. Instead, Emily's eyes filled with tears because she understood the casualty rate behind that shiny bronze medal. She offered to support him with her receptionist income if money was the only reason he wanted adventurer work. The guild provided immediate proof of her fear when a blood-covered knight entered, carrying what remained of a dead teammate. The guild itself made the difference between Lynn's 2 lives feel especially sharp. On Earth, he had entered competitions through websites and digital queues. Here, registration involved sweating over 2 physical silver coins, while armed strangers shouted behind him. One coin carried the Griffin Kingdom's emblem. The other commemorated a northern hero Lynn knew mostly because his face appeared on currency. Pierre barely glanced at either before announcing the combat power requirement. The rule made practical sense once Lynn considered how many desperate summoners probably registered with creatures incapable of surviving real work. What Pierre did not know was that Lynn's summon contained a mechanic his crystal had never been designed to interpret. The reading of 15 already proved the fortified whelp exceeded the minimum comfortably. When the shadow of the death rattle body appeared, the crystal effectively measured a second combat state, layered behind the first. The jump to 45 was the first public sign that Hearthstone effects interacted with local systems in measurable ways. Lynn kept that interpretation private. A mysterious score was useful. An explanation involving another world's game rules would be dangerous. Pierre's instant change in behavior reinforced another lesson Lynn had learned twice in 2 days. Status attracted resources. The same man who offered no warmth to a poor unknown summoner became eager to provide contacts once the crystal displayed value. Lynn did not resent the clerk enough to reject the advantage. If influence came with strength, he planned to use every point of it. Emily's reaction later was harder to dismiss, because she cared about his life rather than his potential. The mangled ranger carried through the guild showed what the bronze badge did not. Adventuring was not a heroic profession with occasional tragedy. Death was common enough that a first-day receptionist had already watched multiple bodies arrive before lunch. The guild could calculate rewards, rank danger, and preserve records, but none of that guaranteed a team returned. Lynn's cheat therefore changed the risk calculation without eliminating risk. Taunt could redirect an attack. Void phasing could avoid one. Respawn might restore a tavern minion. None of those mechanics made Lynn's own human body immortal. That distinction stayed in his mind when he rejected party invitations and entered the Mist Mountains alone. The corpse had been torn apart badly enough that Lynn's stomach nearly rejected breakfast on the spot. Emily admitted she had already seen several dead adventurers brought through the doors on her very first workday. Lynn understood the warning, but the next tavern reset would not accept fear as currency. He apologized, told Emily he had reasons he could not explain, and selected a beginner gathering quest. Mist flowers grew in the nearby Mist Mountains and sold to the guild as ingredients for healing potions. Several teams offered to take the unusual new summoner along, but Lynn refused every invitation. The real issue was not pride. It was what would happen if strangers identified his summon as a dragon. His Twilight whelp carried traits from Warcraft's engineered Twilight Dragons, creatures associated with void and black dragon blood. Lynn had no idea how this world's dragons would react to such an unnatural species appearing under a human's command. Until he understood that danger, solo work protected both the secret and everyone who might ask the wrong questions. The Mist Mountains greeted him with dense fog, wet air, steep ground, and almost useless visibility. Lynn summoned the whelp, then ordered her to enter the void and disappear from ordinary sight. Her ancestry allowed her to phase between reality and another dimension, giving his tiny summon an ability no card text had mentioned. That hidden trait confirmed something important. Real-world versions of Hearthstone creatures possessed more than their printed game mechanics. The first several hours of adventuring were not heroic in any way. Lynn wandered through fog, sweated through his clothes, fought uneven terrain, and learned that gathering quests were mostly tedious survival. After 5 hours, he finally located one mist flower near a lake and prepared the tools Emily had packed for him. His first harvesting attempt snapped the plant and destroyed its value instantly. 5 hours of searching had produced exactly nothing, except a lesson in how delicate magical plants could be. 10 minutes later, he discovered 5 flowers together and approached the second chance with painful concentration. 2 more plants died under his hands, but 3 survived the extraction and finally gave him something sellable. Then, a status notification appeared and unlocked a collection skill from the repeated harvesting work. The skill showed progress toward its first level, proving ordinary actions could develop into measurable abilities through practice. Lynn tested whether regular grass could exploit the system for easy experience and received absolutely nothing. Apparently, the world refused to reward him for pulling weeds, so he returned to actual mist flowers. His next cluster produced an even worse success rate, but the collection meter continued advancing whenever a harvest succeeded. By evening, the mountain fog thickened enough that greed finally lost the argument against common sense. Lynn turned toward home before the terrain or darkness could kill him in some humiliatingly mundane way. A spear suddenly shot through the fog directly toward his head. His body reacted too slowly to dodge, leaving Lynn frozen while the weapon crossed the final distance. Then Fortify's taunt activated and bent the spear away from him in midair. The attack curved unnaturally toward the hidden Twilight whelp, who intercepted it before it could reach her summoner. 4 gray goblins burst from cover immediately afterward and charged together. This was Lynn's first real battle, and his heartbeat became far less theoretical than any game he had ever streamed. He ordered the whelp forward, and the baby dragon answered with an unimpressive roar, followed by very effective violence. 2 goblins collapsed under the pressure of her draconic presence before the fight even reached them. The remaining pair attacked, but claws, teeth, and void phasing made their weapons almost useless. The whelp fought with none of the dignity Lynn associated with dragons, and all the efficiency of an furious house cat. A few frantic seconds later, all 4 goblins were dead, and the summon had taken no meaningful damage. Lynn discovered that summoner combat could be wonderfully straightforward when the creature doing the fighting was stronger than the enemy. He harvested all 4 goblin ears because the guild paid 5 silver coins for each confirmed kill. The work smelled terrible, but 20 silver coins mattered more than dignity when tavern upgrades were waiting. His first expedition ended with several mist flowers, 4 goblin trophies, and 1 near-death experience prevented entirely by taunt. The first goblin ambush also taught Lynn how different knowledge felt once it moved from cards into physics. Taunt did not merely encourage an enemy to switch targets. The spear visibly changed course as if an invisible rule had overridden momentum itself. That meant certain Hearthstone keywords functioned at a conceptual level, rather than through ordinary persuasion or battlefield positioning. The discovery was more important than 4 dead goblins. If Taunt could bend a projectile, other keyword abilities might ignore local power systems in equally impossible ways. Lynn immediately began thinking about freeze, divine shield, poisonous effects, and any future mechanic whose game wording sounded absolute. The whelp's dragon aura was another unprinted advantage. Weak goblins collapsed before she touched them, proving species pressure could matter independently from stats. Her void phasing added yet another layer the card never mentioned. The real-world summon was therefore not a 3-line unit description. It was a living creature whose card mechanics and Warcraft biology existed together. That combination made Lynn's system much stronger and much harder to predict. The mist flower failures provided the opposite lesson. A cheat did not automatically grant competence in unrelated work. Lynn still needed proper tools, preservation knowledge, and repeated practice to harvest a plant without destroying it. Collection appearing as a skill rewarded real effort after the effort occurred. It did not replace the effort beforehand. That balance became a pattern Lynn would keep encountering. Hearthstone could hand him impossible pieces. This world's skill system still demanded that he learn how to use the rest of his life normally. Even the goblin ears had practical details no game prepared him for. They had to be removed cleanly enough for bounty verification. They smelled terrible. They took space. They covered equipment in blood. Lynn earned more in one ugly evening than his parents could earn through months of respectable labor. That economic imbalance explained why adventurers accepted such an absurd death rate. A successful day could change a poor household. An unsuccessful day could end the person trying. Lynn now understood both sides of Emily's fear. Even before returning, Lynn calculated that the day's successful loot equaled months of his parents' farming income. Yet the total still sat far below 4 gold, and the 7-day deadline remained uncomfortably close. While hurrying toward the mountain exit, he heard a large fight somewhere north through the fog. Lynn considered continuing home, then looked at his unimpressive loot and decided one cautious peek might be worth the risk. He covered his face with a crude black mask and approached with the whelp hidden nearby. Through the mist, he found a lone swordsman fighting dozens of goblins and visibly losing stamina. Bodies already covered the ground, but the surviving goblins were closing in faster than the exhausted fighter could stop them. Lynn needed less than a second to notice what that many goblin ears would be worth. He sent the Twilight Whelp into the pack, turning a rescue into an unusually profitable intervention. The dragon's aura disrupted several enemies, while void phasing let her attack from angles ordinary goblins could not answer. The swordsman recovered enough to join the counterattack and released a glowing blade wave that cut down multiple targets. Together they finished the remaining goblins, leaving the stranger alive, and Lynn staring at a field full of bounty material. The swordsman introduced himself as Damien, a magic swordsman wearing rune-covered armor that screamed expensive craftsmanship. When his helmet came off, golden hair and refined features made the wealthy background even more obvious. Damien thanked the masked stranger with complete sincerity and addressed him as a senior adventurer. Lynn lowered his voice, claimed every piece of loot as the rescue fee, and expected the conversation to end there. Instead, Damien cheerfully helped slice off 26 goblin ears and handed the entire pile over. The gesture placed more silver in Lynn's hands than his family usually saw in a very long time. When Damien asked his rescuer's name, Lynn invented Raven because the mask deserved an equally unnecessary secret identity. Damien then became fascinated by the hidden dragon and started firing questions faster than Lynn wanted to answer. Lynn tried to leave, but the rich swordsman asked to join him on future adventures. He refused until Damien mentioned that his father controlled the Radiant Moon Trading Company. The company operated across a huge part of the continent, and Damien personally had access to money Lynn could barely imagine. That still did not change the answer until Damien offered to pay 5 gold coins every week for permission to tag along. Lynn had needed 4 gold in 7 days, and this stranger had just offered more than the entire target as a weekly fee. Damien even promised half the payment immediately and placed 2 real gold coins in Lynn's hand. The mysterious raven lasted only long enough for Lynn to confirm the agreement was backed by Damien's family name. Money defeated the lone wolf persona with humiliating speed, and the two scheduled another meeting for the next morning. Damien practically bounced when Lynn named the meeting place and time, making it obvious that adventure mattered more to him than common sense. Back at the guild, Emily spotted Lynn immediately and checked him from head to toe before celebrating that he had returned alive. Lynn dropped his loot on her counter with enough pride to suggest he had conquered a dungeon instead of surviving one beginner mission. Emily's expression changed when she counted 30 goblin ears rather than the 4 Lynn had personally killed earlier. He accepted the admiration without explaining that most of those trophies came from Damien's rescue payment. Then Emily inspected the mist flowers and delivered a far less pleasant lesson. Without proper preservation, the magical plants lost their life energy before reaching the guild and became worthless. All those hours of careful harvesting produced 0 flower income because Lynn had skipped a beginner detail nobody told him. The goblin ears still paid 150 silver and provided adventure points, while Damien's advance added 2 full gold. Lynn finished day 1 with 3.5 gold coins, only half a gold short of the tavern target. The impossible deadline had nearly disappeared after a single expedition, mostly because one rich runaway had entered his life. Emily finished work soon afterward, and the two walked home while she shared the day's guild gossip. The largest story was the arrival of the Golden Griffin Kingdom's 3rd prince in Maple Leaf Town. A royal astronomer had predicted that darkness would swallow the sun and a black dragon would burn Noah capital. According to the prophecy, the disaster would begin somewhere in the Mist Mountains. That was exactly where Lynn had been gathering flowers and hiding a strange dragon only hours earlier. The prince had come to investigate the warning, but Emily hated him for a reason far more immediate than prophecy. Darahart carried the rare Cursed Knight class and could place life-draining curses on other people. Rather than reserve the ability for criminals or enemies, he reportedly tested it on ordinary civilians for amusement. Several farmers around town had already been cursed since the royal party arrived. The word farmers instantly erased every other thought in Lynn's mind, because both of his parents worked the fields. He broke into a run before Emily finished explaining the story. Elsewhere, Darahart sat inside the expensive Starfruit Tavern, while his butler Roosevelt tried to restrain his cruelty. The prince had white hair from his snowwoman mother, royal red eyes, and the appearance of someone far kinder than his behavior. Roosevelt reminded him that civilians were the foundation of the kingdom and suggested using condemned criminals for curse practice instead. Darahart dismissed ordinary subjects as property available for royal use. The butler also recalled a blacksmith Darahart had cursed to death 3 years earlier. Her husband, Gus, transformed grief into relentless training and eventually became powerful enough to hunt the prince personally. Gus had once caught Darahart and humiliated him so thoroughly that the prince still obsessed over the encounter. That feud mattered little to Lynn, while he sprinted toward the weak orange glow of his family's cabin. Seeing his parents alive through the window finally loosened the fear gripping his chest. Then he entered and found both of them crying. The victims were not Lynn's parents, but Uncle Nick and Aunt Wendy, Emily's mother and father. Lynn had grown up eating at their table and being welcomed into their home like another child. He ran to Emily's house before his mother could finish the explanation. Inside, Emily knelt beside 2 shriveled bodies covered in black curse marks. The curse had drained her parents completely, leaving their faces locked in the pain of their final moments. The cheerful girl who had teased Lynn over card games now looked hollow and barely able to speak. Lynn pulled her into his arms and promised that Darahart would answer for what he had done. Emily begged him not to chase the prince, because losing Lynn would leave her with nobody else. Her grief forced the revenge promise into a more difficult shape. Lynn had to become strong enough to punish Darahart without abandoning her. Emily's loss also changed the meaning of Lynn's money problem. Before that night, Tavern Gold was mostly about unlocking stronger minions because strength itself felt exciting. After seeing Nick and Wendy, every upgrade became part of a specific promise. Darahart had killed people Lynn considered family simply because no one nearby could stop him. Lynn did not want Emily's revenge to depend on another stranger like Gus eventually winning a duel. He wanted enough power to choose the outcome himself. At the same time, Emily's plea made reckless revenge unacceptable. She had just lost both parents and explicitly told Lynn he was the last person she could not bear to lose. Charging a Tier 7 prince with a Level 0 body would turn vengeance into another abandonment. That was why Lynn's promise contained 2 responsibilities that pulled in opposite directions. He had to punish Darahart. He also had to survive long enough to remain beside Emily afterward. The Hearthstone system offered a path between those demands, but only if Lynn respected its pace. A familiar rough voice then intruded on the worst moment possible. Dio arrived with a proposal from the Silverhand mercenary group, claiming they could fund Lynn's summon development. The supposed sponsorship required a 30-year contract, placing both Lynn and his summons under the mercenary group's control. They could send him anywhere, order anything, and own the results of his class for most of his adult life. Dio expected grief and anger to make that bargain sound reasonable. Instead, Lynn recognized a recruitment trap being offered beside the corpses of people he loved. He refused so forcefully that the old adventurer seemed genuinely confused. Dio asked whether Lynn wanted revenge badly enough to accept help, revealing how completely he had misread the situation. Lynn told him exactly what he thought of exploiting Emily's parents for a referral and drove him away. The encounter taught Lynn another lesson about desperation. The first person offering a rope might be selling the drowning man a chain. Dio's funeral-side contract proposal sharpened Lynn's suspicion toward organizations offering power. The Silverhand did not begin by threatening him. They began by presenting resources he genuinely needed: summon food, training materials, connections, and long-term support were exactly what had kept 30 spirits from accepting him. The offer targeted the weakest point in his class and arrived when emotional judgment was already damaged by grief. Only the 30-year ownership clause exposed what the sponsorship really cost. Had Lynn accepted, revenge against Darahart might have become possible, while every future choice belonged to the mercenary group. That was not power. It was renting strength with his entire adult life as collateral. Dio's willingness to sell the contract beside Emily's dead parents made the manipulation impossible to romanticize. By the next morning, Lynn was still furious, but had no intention of abandoning the financial plan that would make revenge possible. He returned to the Mist Mountains in the Black Raven mask and found Damien waiting with unbearable sunrise enthusiasm. Damien greeted his senior like they were beginning the greatest expedition in history, rather than another dangerous hike through fog. Lynn summoned the Twilight Whelp and checked the damage she had taken during the previous day. Her fortified health had dropped, and another serious fight could kill her. The system softened that risk because tavern minions reset to full condition on the next weekly round. Even death would not permanently remove the whelp. The new tavern cycle would restore her. That respawn mechanic made Hearthstone recruits fundamentally different from pack cards or native summons. Damien stared at the baby dragon with open fascination and asked to pet her. Lynn refused and redirected the conversation toward Darahart. Since Damien came from a continent-spanning merchant family, Lynn asked whether money could simply arrange the prince's assassination. Damien nearly choked before explaining that Radiant Moon traded too heavily inside the kingdom to murder royal heirs. Corporate interests protected Darahart almost as effectively as the throne did. Still, Damien believed a grown version of Lynn's dragon could eventually beat the prince without assassination. He described Darahart as a Tier 7 rare-class knight specialized in curses and life drain. The king favored him heavily, which meant revenge would require power strong enough to survive both the prince and royal protection. Lynn estimated that repeated tavern rounds could eventually bridge the gap if he stayed patient. Patience was difficult after seeing Emily's home, but dying early would help nobody. Far away in Noah capital, Damien's father Greenwood was dealing with his son's disappearance in a much louder fashion. Damien had used an emergency space stone worth around 1,000 gold merely to escape home and become an adventurer. The item existed for mortal danger, not teenage independence, and Greenwood was furious enough to shake his headquarters. An old servant named Hall had failed to stop the runaway and endured most of the merchant president's yelling. Greenwood finally called a powerful mage named Lewis to track his son. Lewis arrived dressed more like a farmer than an archmage, yet the spiritual pressure around him made his strength impossible to dismiss. At first he found Damien's escape hilarious and showed no urgency about returning the boy. Greenwood solved that attitude with an expensive magic crystal and a permanent discount across every Radiant Moon store. Lewis immediately decided the runaway child desperately needed discipline. The mage used a purple scrying crystal and found Damien walking through a foggy mountain beside a masked stranger. More importantly, Lewis saw the Twilight Whelp moving near them. The unknown dragon species captured his attention so completely that locating Damien became secondary. In the Mist Mountains, Lynn felt an unexplained chill without knowing a powerful mage had just started such his summon from afar. Lewis focused his divination and confirmed the creature was definitely draconic, but unlike any species he recognized. Greenwood wanted his son. Lewis wanted the dragon. Neither man cared about the other's priority. By the time Lewis determined the pair's location, Lynn had no idea that both were already heading toward him. Lynn and Damien continued deeper into the mountains, while discussing the prophecy about a black dragon destroying the capital. Damien kept glancing between the prophecy's location and Lynn's hidden dragon with an increasingly thoughtful expression. He did not accuse Raven of anything, which Lynn considered the first sign that the wealthy swordsman possessed some restraint. The summoner instead concentrated on harvesting enough mist flowers to advance collection. He had studied the proper technique overnight and completed the next extractions cleanly. Damien offered to help, but Lynn protected every point of skill experience with the possessiveness of a competitive grinder. The ground suddenly began shaking before the flower discussion could continue. A thorn wild boar emerged from the fog, enormous, armored in dark hide and covered in dangerous spikes. For rookie adventurers, the creature was nearly tier 1 and strong enough to flatten inexperienced teams. For Lynn, the important detail was its market value. The meat could sell for several gold, while the tusks were valuable crafting material for rogue weapons. The combined reward immediately became worth more than his remaining tavern deadline. Lynn accepted the risk, and Damien celebrated the decision like someone had opened an amusement park. The magic swordsman ignited both blades with orange flame and charged the boar directly. His courage lasted until the first collision launched him several meters backward. Expensive runic armor created a cushion before he hit the ground, proving even Damien's accidents had premium protection. Lynn sent the Twilight Whelp forward to absorb pressure while Damien recovered. Her claws that had shredded goblins barely scratched the boar's hide, and her dragon aura failed to frighten it. Void phasing kept her alive, but the creature was simply too large and stubborn for intimidation. Damien re-entered the battle and began dealing the meaningful damage through magic-infused sword strikes. He eventually gathered blue energy around one blade for a stronger finishing attack. The boar responded by curling its body and firing hundreds of back spikes in a violent spread. Damien's technique destroyed some projectiles, but far too many remained on course to tear through him. Lynn made an instant decision and added Damien to the whelp's friendly roster. Taunt activated across the entire attack. Every spike changed direction mid-flight and redirected toward the Twilight Whelp instead of the swordsman. The baby dragon phased away from many, but the sheer volume overwhelmed her defense. Spikes pierced the whelp until her fortified body finally died. Damien's face collapsed in grief because he believed the dragon had sacrificed itself permanently to save him. Then the death rattle resolved. A larger Twilight hatchling emerged from the fallen whelp, stronger, angrier, and immediately ready to attack. Damien's tears vanished into complete confusion, while Lynn struggled not to laugh behind the mask. The hatchling carried 3 across its main combat attributes, but no longer had taunt. For this fight, the extra strength mattered more than Lynn's future safety concerns. The new dragon struck the boar's eye, blinded it, and turned the remaining battle into a brutal cleanup. Damien resumed attacking, and together they finally dropped the giant animal. 7 gold worth of meat and tusks now lay on the ground, making the dead whelp financially productive in the strangest possible way. Damien demanded an explanation for the larger dragon. Lynn calmly claimed the first summon had achieved enlightenment through death and evolved on the spot. The explanation was ridiculous, so Damien naturally concluded Lynn simply owned 2 separate dragons. Lynn accepted that misunderstanding because it produced fewer questions. Damien used a storage ring to absorb the massive boar corpse, and Lynn immediately wanted the same convenience. The desire disappeared when Damien explained that even a generous family discount would cost hundreds of gold. Lynn had entered adventuring to earn single-digit gold amounts. Storage magic still belonged to another economic universe. With the whelp gone and the hatchling lacking taunt, Lynn ended the expedition early. Damien protested because it was barely midday, and they had planned much more. Lynn explained that taunt was the mechanic keeping his actual human body from being stabbed, shot, or crushed. The stronger hatchling was excellent offense, but without forced targeting, it could not replace that protection. Damien's appearance also gave Lynn his first close look at what wealth could buy an adventurer before talent was even considered. The runes on the swordsman's armor were not decorative. Each plate stored magic, softened impacts, and likely cost more than Lynn's entire household could accumulate through farming. Damien treated that equipment as normal, because he had never lived where 2 silver coins could determine whether someone registered for work. That difference explained why offering 5 gold each week sounded casual to him. For Lynn, the same amount represented the difference between progressing his system and wasting an entire tavern cycle. The partnership therefore started with completely different motivations. Damien wanted experience, danger, and the feeling of earning an adventurer identity separate from his father's company. Lynn wanted money and a companion strong enough to improve the profit from dangerous encounters. Neither motivation required lying about the arrangement. The first boar battle proved both sides received real value. Damien's sword techniques could injure creatures the Twilight Whelp barely scratched. Lynn's taunt mechanic saved Damien from the spike barrage. His armor could not fully stop. Their strengths were complementary even before trust had time to develop. The whelp's death also gave Lynn his first chance to observe death rattle under lethal real-world conditions. There was no delay for mourning, no ritual, and no separate summoning cost. The larger dragon appeared because the first body died, exactly as the card promised. Damien's confusion was understandable, because local summon evolution did not normally happen in the middle of death like that. Lynn's fake explanation about enlightenment worked only because the actual mechanism sounded even less believable. The hatchling's lack of taunt created a real strategic trade-off instead of a simple upgrade. More strength made fights easier. Losing force protection made Lynn personally easier to kill. That was why staying home for the rest of the week was not cowardice disguised as caution. It was a decision based on which body the system could replace. The dragon could return next round. Lynn could not. He intended to spend the remaining days before the reset safely at home, rather than gambling his life for unnecessary profit. Damien sadly admitted the logic was difficult to argue with. Before they could separate, an enormous hand grabbed Damien from behind and lifted him by the neck. Greenwood had finally arrived. Damien's father shared the same golden hair but carried the posture of a merchant who expected rooms to reorganize around him. He thanked Lynn for keeping the runaway alive, then tossed over a storage ring without ceremony. The gift was far beyond anything Damien had mentioned. A high-grade mithril ring with about 10 square meters of internal space. Lynn could barely process receiving equipment worth hundreds of gold from a man he had never met. Greenwood clarified that generosity had nothing to do with it. He had studied Lynn, noticed the unusual dragon, and considered the ring an investment in someone with obvious future value. The merchant president then turned away from his new investment and began disciplining Damien with repeated slaps. Damien insisted he only wanted to become a real adventurer, while Greenwood insisted his current skills would get him killed. Their argument echoed through the mountain until a portal opened nearby. Lewis stepped through wearing his plaid shirt and brown hat, laughing at the family scene with deeply unsettling enthusiasm. Damien begged the mage for help and received none, because Lewis was already staring at Lynn's hatchling. The archmage asked to inspect the summon more closely. Every instinct Lynn possessed warned him against allowing a powerful stranger to study his most important secret. Every other instinct reminded him that refusing a Tier 7 mage standing within arm's reach might be equally foolish. Lynn permitted the examination, because tavern minions would reset anyway, and because Lewis clearly had the strength to ignore objections. The hatchling hissed while Lewis inspected its body and compared it to the smaller creature he had scryed earlier. He immediately asked how a baby dragon had become noticeably older in only a few hours. Lynn gave no useful answer, and Lewis moved on to the far stranger discovery. His mental probe detected corrupted spatial energy running through the dragon. The void pushed back against the mage's consciousness and attempted to distort the very mind examining it. Rather than retreat, Lewis became delighted. He had found an unknown power capable of resisting a high-tier mage's spiritual investigation. Lynn knew enough Warcraft lore to understand that void energy was associated with corruption, madness, and cosmic danger. Lewis treated that warning sign like a research invitation. The mage finally offered compensation for the examination, instead of simply satisfying his own curiosity. He promised to enter the spirit realm and ask an old acquaintance to arrange a strong native summon for Lynn. After 30 rejections, an introduction from a Tier 7 archmage sounded like the kind of unfair networking advantage Lynn desperately needed. Lynn accepted the offer and privately decided that Lewis could discover the consequences of void research on his own. Lewis's research offer brought another contrast into focus. Native high-tier mages viewed an unknown power as knowledge to be conquered, even when that power actively attacked their minds. Lynn viewed the same void energy through years of Warcraft lore and saw warning labels everywhere. He knew the Twilight Dragon lineage had been engineered from Black Dragon and Nether Dragon influences under forces connected to the void. He also knew corruption in that setting rarely stopped, because a curious scholar promised to be careful. Yet explaining all of that would require revealing a second world, a game franchise, and knowledge impossible for a farmer's son to possess. So Lynn stayed quiet and watched Lewis make discoveries on his own. The extracted void essence later confirmed the energy could exist outside the dragon's body. That single tube could become a research breakthrough, a disaster, or both. Lewis reacted to the possibility of surpassing established magical limits rather than the possibility of losing his sanity. His behavior was reckless, but it was also intellectually honest. He never pretended curiosity was charity. The home golem later proved that same man could be deeply considerate while remaining socially bizarre. Lynn began to see Lewis as dangerous, without automatically seeing him as malicious. That distinction mattered because powerful allies in this world rarely came packaged as simple heroes. Greenwood was similar in a different direction. The merchant president gave Lynn an enormously valuable storage ring, but openly called it an investment. There was no false claim of friendship. Greenwood had seen a rare dragon, seen his son trust Raven, and purchased a place in Lynn's future with equipment. Lynn respected the clarity. An honest transaction could be safer than affection with hidden conditions. That lesson would shape how he judged the Silver Hand almost immediately afterward. A thunderous sound rolled through the mountains before the agreement could continue. The ground shook, trees swayed, and even the fog seemed to vibrate around something enormous. Damien immediately wanted to investigate whatever had caused it. Lynn immediately wanted to go home. His system already promised guaranteed progression every week, so charging toward unknown disasters for entertainment made no strategic sense. Lewis also declined because the dragon remained more interesting to him, while Greenwood refused because adventuring was exactly what he came to stop. Damien looked personally betrayed by 3 consecutive adults choosing survival over curiosity. Deeper in the Mist Mountains, Deerheart and Roosevelt stood near the source of the disturbance. A mountain ridge had split open while dense fog poured from below, like smoke from an enormous wound. From the broken earth, a massive dark structure slowly rose into view. A new dungeon had appeared. Only a small number of dungeons were known across the entire world, and each one represented extraordinary monsters, resources, and wealth. Roosevelt urged immediate retreat because the unstable space around a newly formed dungeon could kill them before any treasure mattered. Deerheart ignored the warning long enough to ask whether the prophesied black dragon might be inside. The new structure became known as Mist City, tying the apocalypse prophecy, Deerheart, and Lynn's hunting grounds together at one location. Lynn was extremely satisfied that he had chosen to leave. 3 deliberately quiet days followed. Greenwood dragged Damien back to Noah Capital. Despite the boy's repeated complaints about missing the new dungeon, Emily moved into Lynn's family home because returning alone to the house where her parents died was unbearable. The guild granted her a few paid days of leave, an administrative response that felt insultingly small beside the loss. Lynn spent most of his time supporting Emily and refusing every unnecessary reason to enter the mountains. The hatchling had no taunt, the money target was already met, and survival remained more useful than pride. His only regular exception was visiting Lewis for controlled research sessions on the dragon. Eventually, Lewis extracted a small amount of writhing black void essence into a glass tube. The hatchling looked exhausted afterward, but the mage looked happier than Lynn had ever seen another person look around dangerous corruption. Lewis believed understanding the energy might eventually push his magic beyond current limits. Lynn privately gave him a generous estimate before the experiment transformed him into some future void-corrupted disaster. Still, Lewis had treated the dragon carefully and kept his promise about finding Lynn another summon. The mage vanished into the spirit realm to contact his old friend. That freedom to teleport between places reminded Lynn how small his own power still was. Elsewhere in the spirit realm, Ashera had been dealing with an entirely different consequence of rejecting him. Her heart-tipped tail had shifted toward pink, a rare succubus sign connected to genuine romantic attachment. She had met Lynn once, rejected his finances, and then spent the following days thinking about his face. The clan matriarch summoned Ashera and criticized her for remaining the only succubus of her generation without a master. An old mage friend had recommended a young summoner who might become extremely important if he survived long enough. The matriarch ordered Ashera to sign with that candidate the following day. Ashera protested that she had not even met him. Her matriarch cared far more about the recommendation than the objection. Then she noticed the pink tail and demanded to know who had caused it. Ashera admitted that a strikingly handsome summoner had approached her recently, but she rejected him for being poor. The matriarch was horrified by the reasoning rather than the romance. In her view, a man attractive enough to turn a succubus tail pink was unlikely to remain poor forever. She ordered Ashera to forget the missed opportunity and focus on the new summoner Lewis had recommended. Neither woman realized that both men were Lynn. When Lewis returned, he told Lynn to meet the arranged summon in the spirit realm the next afternoon. He added several suspicious comments about self-control that Lynn did not understand and did not find reassuring. The same day would also bring Lynn's next Hearthstone tavern visit, making the schedule unusually important. Maple Leaf Town had already changed because adventurers flooded in after the appearance of Mist City. Shops filled, guild traffic exploded, and the quiet farming town began behaving like the center of a gold rush. Lynn also noticed a woman in silver armor associated with the Silver Hand mercenary group. Nearby, Dio knelt before her with enough deference to confirm the old adventurer was still involved with the organization Lynn had rejected. Lynn could not hear the conversation, but he recognized scheming when he saw it. At home, Emily remained emotionally numb despite being physically safe. During dinner, she asked whether someone with a non-combat class could ever gain true supernatural power. Conventional knowledge said a divine job class fixed a person's path permanently. Lynn questioned that assumption because the gods had created the current class system, meaning some form of power might have existed before it. He promised Emily that he would search for another path rather than accept that her actuary awakening defined her forever. For the first time since her parents died, a small spark returned to her eyes. The following afternoon, Lynn met Lewis at the Starfruit Tavern and activated Spirit Realm communication. Gray fog swallowed the room, and Lewis created a private meeting space inside the Spirit Realm. A female silhouette appeared through the haze. Lynn recognized Ashera at the same moment Ashera recognized the summoner she had rejected. Both reacted with immediate disbelief. Lynn refused the contract on principle before Lewis could even explain the arrangement. Ashera panicked and insisted her earlier decision had been wrong. She admitted that she had thought about him constantly after their first meeting and displayed the glowing pink tail as proof. Lewis recognized the biological sign and became far too entertained by the entire situation. Lynn remained suspicious that regret might have appeared only after a powerful mage endorsed his future. Lewis explained that the tail color could not be consciously faked and represented genuine succubus attachment. That matched information Lynn had previously treated as romantic folklore rather than actual biology. He finally asked the only practical question that mattered. Could Ashera accept a contract without her normal daily dark essence requirement? She agreed instantly. For once, charisma accomplished what money could not. Ashera's contract created a second kind of summon relationship beside Hearthstone. The Twilight Whelp came through a system Lynn controlled and never negotiated salary, food, or consent. Ashera was a native intelligent spirit with her own clan, desires, maintenance needs, and reasons for choosing a master. Her earlier rejection had been insulting, but it had also been a rational decision based on resources. Her return became meaningful because the reason changed. The pink tail told Lynn emotion was now strong enough to overcome the economic condition that stopped her before. That did not erase his suspicion. 20 charisma could distort people's behavior so dramatically that Lynn had trouble knowing where normal attraction ended and supernatural influence began. Kelly's later reaction would make the problem even more obvious. For now, the contract gave Lynn something Hearthstone minions did not, a partner who understood the spirit realm from inside. Ashera also had abilities built around desire, rather than direct combat alone. Darkthorn was easy to classify. Whip of Desire was morally uglier. Lynn immediately thought improbability, because that was how a lifelong gamer processed low-chance effects. Repeated attempts raised the chance that at least one would succeed. The math was straightforward. The ethical consequence of turning living enemies into permanent servants was not. At this stage, Lynn accepted the ability as a weapon for people already trying to harm him. He had not yet decided what line, if any, would stop him from using it more broadly. That unresolved tension fit his Second Life worldview better than pretending he was a spotless hero. He cared intensely about his family and Emily. He could also watch Lewis extract void energy out of curiosity and laugh at the possible consequences. His morality was personal before it was universal. Once the contract formed, Ashera materialized in the physical world, wearing black and staring at Lynn as though 20 charisma were a natural disaster. Lynn ignored the flirting long enough to inspect what the new summon could actually do. Her strength reached 3, Constitution 2, Agility 4, Spirit 4, and Charisma 11. Agility and Spirit were both specialty attributes, placing her above ordinary summons even before any training. Lynn's Twilight Whelp possessed 4 specialty attributes, which explained why experienced people reacted so strongly to the dragon. Ashera's first skill condensed dark energy into thorns that could strike at range or up close while corroding whatever they hit. Her second ability, Whip of Desire, attacked the target's deepest wants and carried a tiny chance of creating a desire slave. The probability was low, but Lynn's competitive brain immediately understood that repeated attempts could eventually force the outcome. He pictured captured enemies becoming permanently loyal after enough applications and laughed with more villainous enthusiasm than the thought deserved. Ashera found the laugh attractive, which told Lynn something worrying about her taste. Then the cost of maintaining a native summon finally appeared. Ashera continuously drained Lynn's spirit while she remained manifested. With only 3 spirit, he could keep her out for less than an hour. before the strain became physically painful. That limitation made a meditation method suddenly urgent, because his new contract was powerful but unsustainable. Ashera's old maintenance requirement did not vanish because the contract changed. She still preferred dark essence as a normal resource for succubus growth. What changed was her willingness to stay without demanding that Lynn provide it every day. That distinction mattered, because a contract built on impossible upkeep would have become another delayed failure. Her spirit drain created a second cost Lynn could measure immediately. At full manifestation, the first portion of the summon window felt manageable. As his available spirit approached exhaustion, pressure turned into a sharp mental ache. Keeping her present too long would leave him unable to use other cards or react to sudden danger. That meant Ashera could not simply remain beside him all day like Millhouse. She needed to be summoned for a purpose, dismissed when the purpose ended, and supported by future meditation growth. The limit also kept Lynn from treating every problem as something a succubus could solve for him. Even a strong contract required resource management. While Lynn learned his summon, Dio was reporting to the Silverhand's vice captain Kelly. Kelly had taken Lynn's refusal personally because a commoner summoner without wealthy backing was too rare for her organization to ignore. She believed his appearance suggested he had already attracted a strong female humanoid summon, making him even more valuable. More importantly, Kelly said the Silverhand's hidden plan specifically required a rookie summoner. Other candidates had families, schools, or organizations powerful enough to retaliate. Lynn appeared to be the one easy target whose parents were only farmers. Kelly ordered Dio to arrange a kidnapping within 3 days and promised 300 gold for delivering Lynn alive. Dio's hesitation lasted only until greed finished the calculation. Lynn knew none of this and spent the evening thinking about his next visit to Bob's tavern. That night he entered the Dream Tavern without crossing the exhausting wasteland from his first visit. Bob was absent. Behind the bar stood the familiar dwarf innkeeper Lynn remembered from standard Hearthstone. The sight hit even harder than Bob because this voice had accompanied years of card games before Battlegrounds became Lynn's specialty. The innkeeper greeted him warmly and produced a card pack as a welcome gift. Lynn nearly opened it immediately, then stopped because pack opening carried irrational ceremonial importance to his gamer brain. First came the tavern economy. He exchanged 4 real gold coins for 4 tavern coins, and the innkeeper confirmed the next weekly cap would rise again. The shop still displayed familiar low-tier options, including Anoiotron, Mana Saber, another Twilight Whelp, and a buff spell. A second whelp tempted Lynn because 3 copies could eventually combine into a golden version and award a higher-tier discovery. His old Battlegrounds instincts loved triples enough to destroy otherwise sensible plans. This time he refused the temptation. The correct tempo play was upgrading the tavern to Tier 2 and expanding the future recruit pool. All 4 coins disappeared into the upgrade. A golden flash confirmed that stronger minions could appear from the next refresh onward. Only then did Lynn return to the free card pack. 5 cards burst into the air when he opened it. The first was Glacial Shard, a cheap elemental whose battlecry froze an enemy. The second was Nesting Puppet, an undead creature that could repeatedly resummon weaker versions of itself after death. Its spirit cost exceeded Lynn's current capacity, immediately turning a useful card into inaccessible inventory. The third card erupted with Legendary Light. For one glorious instant, Lynn expected an icon capable of changing the entire world. Then Millhouse Manastorm announced himself. In ordinary Hearthstone, Millhouse was notorious for giving the opponent free spells on the following turn. Lynn had pulled a legendary on his first pack, and somehow landed one of the game's most mocked examples. Disappointment lasted only until he remembered the Twilight Whelp's unprinted void abilities. The real-world version of Millhouse might carry the absurd magical history his card failed to represent. Warcraft lore treated the gnome as comic relief, but he had survived catastrophes, dimensional incidents, and situations that would kill normal mages. Lynn stored that question for later, rather than dismissing the legendary immediately. The remaining pack cards were powerful spells that demanded more spirit than Lynn possessed. One could strengthen and duplicate an allied minion, while making it difficult for spells to target. Another could summon either defensive ghost wolves or aggressive ghost hawks, depending on the chosen effect. At 3 spirit, Lynn could not use either. Then the innkeeper revealed a rule that completely changed how Lynn viewed pack cards. Tavern recruits returned on weekly resets, but creatures summoned from card packs were permanent one-use assets. If a pack creature died, there would be no automatic resurrection. Another copy required pulling the same card again from a future pack. That made Millhouse less like a disposable minion and more like an irreplaceable strategic weapon. The second tavern visit made Lynn's economy problem more complicated because card packs and tavern recruits belonged to separate systems. Tavern coins bought the Battlegrounds shop. Real gold entered through a weekly conversion cap that increased round by round. Pack purchases ignored that tiny tavern budget and demanded hundreds of gold directly. That meant becoming stronger required 2 income plans at once. A few gold kept the tavern advancing. Hundreds bought access to collectible cards outside the rotating recruit pool. The free pack also taught Lynn that spirit functioned like mana for those cards. Nesting Puppet needed more spirit than he possessed, so owning the card did not mean he could deploy it. The duplication spell and nature spell suffered the same problem. Future wealth without future spirit would leave powerful assets locked inside his mind. Millhouse was therefore valuable for 2 separate reasons. He could fight. He could potentially teach Lynn, interacted with the imported card system. The legendary gnome also introduced permanent logistics. Unlike the Twilight Whelp, he could not simply be dismissed as a disposable tavern piece and forgotten until needed. He had a personality, hunger, pride, a wife back in another world, and memories Lynn recognized from Warcraft. Summoning him felt less like playing a card and more like moving a person across realities. That distinction made the one-use rule much heavier. If Millhouse died here, Lynn might never see this version of him again. The card's rarity was not merely economic, it was existential. Lynn asked how to obtain more packs. The innkeeper named the price at 500 gold for 1 ordinary pack per week. A golden pack cost 10 times more, carried no purchase limit, and provided cosmetic versions rather than better combat performance. Lynn stared at the smiling dwarf and decided monetization had somehow become more predatory after reincarnation. His weekly budget had just increased from a few gold for tavern progression to hundreds if he wanted every available pack. The storage ring Greenwood gifted him was worth enough to cover 1 purchase, but selling it would attract attention and sacrifice invaluable utility. The second pack's unusable spells were still worth studying because they defined what higher spirit would unlock. Cult Disruption could strengthen an allied minion, give it elusive protection from targeted spells, and then create a copy. On the Twilight Whelp, that could potentially produce multiple defensive bodies, with effects local mages struggled to target. The nature spell offered a different choice. One mode summoned 3 smaller spectral wolves carrying taunt. The other created 2 stronger spectral hawks with wind fury, effectively trading defense for repeated attacks. Both options were excellent tactical tools. Both sat completely beyond Lynn because their costs exceeded 3 spirit. That frustration turned meditation from optional efficiency into progression bottleneck number 1. The innkeeper's pricing reinforced the same problem from the financial side. 1 normal pack cost 500 gold and could only be purchased once each week. Golden packs cost several thousand and removed the weekly limit without improving combat statistics. They were effectively cosmetics at a price that could buy houses. Lynn had spent years around digital card economies and recognized scarcity design immediately. A weekly limit made skipping a pack feel like losing an opportunity forever. The system was using fear of falling behind against someone already vulnerable to card game completion instincts. Knowing the trick did not change the fact that more cards meant more real combat options. He needed money anyway. Lynn woke with a new problem larger than the one he had just solved. He had enough for the immediate tavern cycle, but future card packs demanded a completely different level of income. Morning revealed the same unstable wooden ceiling, reminding him that his family still lived in a house barely worthy of the word. He wrote down practical goals: obtain a meditation method, maintain tavern gold, pursue card pack money, and eventually improve the house. Then Emily arrived carrying wheat and finally looking more alive. It was Harvest Festival, the largest agricultural holiday in the kingdom, and the birthday celebration of the harvest goddess. The blessing associated with the day improved crops, broadly enough that even wars were known to pause in respect for the festival. Guild work stopped, shops closed, and Lynn decided one peaceful day would be healthy for both of them. Emily needed ordinary life after grief, and Lynn had spent 16 years treating childhood like a training schedule. They stepped outside and found a 2-story clay golem sitting beside the front door. Neighbors watched from a safe distance while experienced adventurers very carefully avoided approaching it. Lynn summoned the Twilight Whelp and activated Taunt before the golem slowly extended an enormous hand. A letter rested on its palm. The terrible handwriting belonged to Lewis. He explained that the golem was a home guardian created after hearing what had happened to Emily's family. Only high-tier mages could build such protectors, meaning the construct was also a visible warning against anyone targeting ordinary people inside the house. Lynn had never asked Lewis for protection, Yet the eccentric mage had identified his greatest vulnerability and covered it anyway. That generosity affected Lynn more than the Archmage's usual research excitement ever had. Lewis also apologized for leaving suddenly because a legendary location called Shadow City had appeared above the Sahara Desert. The floating fortress belonged to the ancient Alpha Empire, a magical civilization whose knowledge had disappeared thousands of years earlier. For a researcher like Lewis, the return of that city outweighed almost every ordinary danger. The Sahara region bordered forces associated with an endless hell dimension, making the expedition extremely risky even for him. Lynn folded the letter with genuine concern and privately wished the strange mage would survive his obsession. Emily stared between the golem, the hidden dragon, and Lynn with growing suspicion about how rapidly his life had changed. A few days earlier, he was a rejected summoner. Now a high-tier mage had assigned a guardian to protect his family. Lynn reminded her to keep his secrets and repeated that he intended to become strong enough to avenge her parents. This time, Emily looked as though she truly believed him. A new stranger interrupted before the moment could settle. The man was almost 2 meters tall, massively built, and carried a sword so large it looked closer to a metal slab. His life energy made Lynn's instincts scream caution before he even spoke. The stranger asked where he might find the third prince. Lynn suggested the Starfruit Tavern, the obvious lodging for someone of Derahart's status. The man thanked him and introduced himself as Gus. Recognition hit Lynn a heartbeat later. This was the widower who had spent years hunting Derahart after the prince cursed his wife to death. Gus launched himself through the air, hard enough to crater the ground, and landed near the tavern. His challenge to Derahart echoed across Maple Leaf Town. The prince emerged, and the hatred between them looked powerful enough to start the fight without either man moving. Before the first strike, a wine-red-haired woman appeared and declared that fighting was forbidden at the Starfruit Tavern. A vast magic circle activated above both men. One flash later, Gus and Derahart had been teleported away from the town itself. The battle resumed in the Mist Mountains, where civilians could watch only from a distance. Gus formed a colossal ice blade whose cold altered the sky around it. Derahart answered with an enormous gray curse sigil, the same kind of power that had killed Emily's parents on a much smaller scale. For Lynn, the spectacle became a brutal measurement of the power gap between himself and the people he wanted to challenge. Then a third force entered the fight. A beam of sacred light joined Derahart's side rather than Gus's. The Church of Light, official religion of the kingdom, had chosen royal protection over justice for the murdered blacksmith. The clash between Gus and Derahart mattered because Lynn could finally compare high-tier abilities with the game-like rules he possessed. Gus's ice did not resemble a slightly stronger frostbolt. It reshaped weather across a visible portion of the mountains. Derahart's curse did not look like the marks left on two farmers. At full scale, it became a massive field of gray authority spreading through the sky. Then the church's holy light entered and proved that visual holiness said nothing about moral alignment. The same type of sacred power ordinary people prayed to was now helping protect the man who murdered Emily's parents. For Lynn, that image ended any remaining temptation to treat divine institutions as automatic sources of justice. Gods granted classes. Churches served politics. Individuals still had to decide what they considered right. That lesson would later influence the rule he gave the Hearthstone legends. Fighting two powerful opponents at once forced Gus to retreat. Derahart wanted pursuit, but Roosevelt convinced him that reporting the new dungeon to the capital mattered more. Lynn watched the battlefield, calm, and understood that revenge against the prince meant confronting institutions as well as one cruel man. The woman who had removed both fighters from town was Florina, owner of the Starfruit Tavern and apparently a hidden powerhouse mage. Florina's relationship with Emily had started before any of Lynn's recent adventures. The tavern owner occasionally gave Emily drinks or treats because the girl's blue hair reminded her of someone from her own past. Lynn did not know the full story behind that resemblance. He did know Florina's kindness had never required Emily to be powerful or useful. That detail separated her from the transactional behavior Lynn had encountered elsewhere. When Florina later discussed magic with Milhouse, the meeting therefore carried two different kinds of trust. Emily trusted her character. Milhouse respected her knowledge. Lynn trusted both judgments enough to leave them alone together. The Starfruit Tavern itself also had more authority than its luxurious reputation suggested. Florina had removed Gus and Derahart from town with one spell before either high-tier fighter could ignore her rule. A business capable of enforcing peace on people at that level was not simply a place that served expensive meals. It was neutral ground, backed by someone powerful enough to make neutrality real. Emily knew Florina personally because the tavern owner had always treated her kindly. Lynn immediately recognized that relationship as something worth preserving, especially with Lewis now absent. While Harvest Festival continued, Dio met a one-eyed criminal from the Viper Gang. The rogue insulted Dio before money changed the tone of the conversation. Kelly's 300 gold bounty gave Dio room to outsource the kidnapping and keep most of the reward himself. After aggressive bargaining, the two settled on a much smaller payment for abducting Lynn. Dio would pocket the difference if the plan succeeded. Lynn spent the same afternoon walking through festival streets with Emily, completely unaware that criminals were calculating the market price of his freedom. He bought her flowers, and the simple gift pulled another genuine smile from her. At home, Lynn's mother noticed far more than either teenager realized. She saw the flowers, Emily's blush, their lifelong closeness, and immediately began imagining a future marriage. In this world, people often married soon after class awakening established their adult path. Lynn's mother privately considered a guild receptionist and an adventurer who had grown up together an obvious match. She cornered Emily outside Lynn's room and asked what she thought of her son. Emily's face gave away the answer before any words did. When Lynn's mother jokingly invited her to start using the word mom, Emily whispered it back. That single response sent the older woman into the kitchen with enough joy to prepare a festival feast. Harvest Festival gave Lynn a rare view of Maple Leaf Town without a deadline attached. Farmers decorated doors with wheat. Children carried small harvest charms. Even adventurers, who normally measured a day in bounties and injuries, slowed down long enough to eat with families. The holiday mattered because the harvest goddess's blessing was visible through crops, rather than abstract doctrine. People could point to better yields and treat celebration as gratitude for something materially useful. That practical faith contrasted sharply with Lynn's experience of the Church of Light protecting their heart. Emily needed the ordinary atmosphere even more than he did. Her grief had made every room quiet since her parents died. Walking through familiar streets, choosing flowers, and hearing festival noise gave her something to respond to besides loss. Lynn did not mistake a smile for recovery. He simply noticed that she could smile at all. His mother's matchmaking enthusiasm later grew from the same protective instinct. Emily had effectively lost her household. Lynn's parents already considered her family. Marriage customs in this world made the next step seem obvious to who watched the two grow up together. Lynn remained oblivious because his attention had been hijacked by systems, revenge, and magical roommates. That imbalance made Emily's whispered acceptance of the word mom more emotionally important than Lynn ever realized that evening. She was not only admitting affection, she was choosing a family structure after her own had been destroyed. Lynn missed the entire exchange because he had finally summoned Millhouse Manastorm in private. The legendary gnome appeared in red and blue robes, with a body barely tall enough to reach an adult's waist. His physical attributes were solid. His spirit was not solid, it was monstrous. Millhouse possessed 45 spirit, 15 times Lynn's own value. The number immediately reframed the supposedly terrible legendary card. Then Lynn opened the skill list. Millhouse's core ability created energy crystals that granted stacking damage increases, while he remained within their influence. At maximum accumulation, the ability could trigger a devastating shadow attack called Doom. Beyond that core mechanic, Millhouse carried a library of elemental, arcane, defensive, and control spells. Frost magic, shadow magic, counters, missiles, fire techniques, suppression, and more all appeared on one panel. The evaluation praised his research foundation and magical fundamentals while leaving combat reliability uncertain. Millhouse's panel also listed a unique spiritual specialization connected to tenacity. The number helped explain how a tiny gnome survived dimensional disasters that should have erased an ordinary body. His core unstoppable sequence was more complicated than a single damage spell. Energy crystals created zones where the effect could stack repeatedly. Each stack amplified offensive output by a fixed percentage. Enough uninterrupted accumulation could reach 100 stacks, and roughly multiply several times over. At that threshold, Doom became available as a massive shadow finisher. The weakness was obvious from Lynn's memories. Millhouse needed time to build the sequence, and his personality encouraged theatrics during exactly the moments when simple execution mattered. That was how a random interruption could turn a terrifying ultimate into comedy. Lynn's role was therefore not to teach Millhouse magic. It was to keep the gnome from sabotaging his own best tools. The ordinary spell list supported that strategy. Frostbolt provided control. Counterspell disrupted enemy casting. Arcane missiles offered repeated ranged pressure. Fire and shadow attacks covered different damage types. Deflection and suppression gave defensive or battlefield control options. Millhouse was not one giant nuke. He was an entire mage toolkit attached to an ego that required supervision. That final ambiguity matched Lynn's memories perfectly. Milhouse possessed absurd talent and equally absurd history as a walking disaster. In this world, however, Lynn could direct him, instead of trusting the chaotic behavior that made the gnome infamous in Warcraft. Another advantage appeared immediately. Milhouse's harmful battle cry activated the instant he entered reality when no enemy existed nearby. The effect granting enemies free spells expired harmlessly with nobody available to benefit. One of Hearthstone's worst downsides had been neutralized by summoning timing. Milhouse opened his eyes and immediately began announcing his own greatness. Lynn challenged the ego by naming famous Azeroth mages who had achieved far more impressive reputations. Each name visibly wounded the gnome's pride until Lynn offered a future possibility. If Milhouse helped earn enough money for more packs, Lynn might eventually summon those legendary figures too. That transformed bragging into motivation. Dinner interrupted the argument, forcing Lynn to decide how to introduce a permanent gnome roommate to his family. He described Milhouse as a powerful mage friend. His mother heard the word mage and immediately treated the guest like visiting nobility. Mages occupied an elite social position in this world, inheriting prestige from an ancient age when magical civilization had dominated history. Lynn's father mostly froze and let his wife handle the social panic. Emily asked whether Milhouse had created the golem outside. The gnome inspected it and insulted the workmanship so aggressively that Lewis would have been furious to hear the review. He even compared it unfavorably with constructs made by his wife, Maleficent. Lynn responded by mentioning the famous occasions when Maleficent had chased her husband with a wrench. Milhouse nearly exploded from embarrassment before the summoning bond reminded him that attacking Lynn was not an option. A crash and 2 screams outside ended the argument. Lynn called the Twilight Whelp instantly and phased her into the void. Before his parents could clearly see what appeared, Milhouse noticed the dragon's presence and reacted with immediate disgust toward the familiar void signature. His past dimensional experiences gave him personal reasons to hate Twilight Dragon energy. Lynn ordered him to stay focused because the screams outside sounded suspiciously familiar. Minutes earlier, Dio and the one-eyed viper rogue Scott had been hiding near the house. They expected farmers, a grieving receptionist, and one inexperienced summoner. Scott suggested killing everyone except the target if witnesses became inconvenient. Dio hesitated briefly, then accepted the possibility in exchange for Kelly's reward. Both men approached with lockpicks and completely failed to account for Lewis's enormous golem. The Guardian's eyes lit up the moment they entered its protected area. Dio reacted fast and used the defensive counter technique that had kept him alive through decades of adventuring. The golem's rune-enhanced fist smashed through the block and launched him away anyway. Scott saw the failed defense and immediately chose escape. Milhouse stepped outside in time to notice the fleeing rogue. A frostbolt caught Scott before he had covered much distance. The gnome followed with fire magic against Dio, while the golem kept the veteran pinned. 2 Tier 1 criminals were neutralized in moments by a legendary mage and a house security construct. Milhouse's first real fight outside Lynn's private testing was also an important reliability check. His opening against Scott and Dio showed that the gnome could cast opposite elements without preparation or spoken incantations. Frost-controlled movement. Fire punished a stationary target. Both arrived so quickly that 2 experienced Tier 1 fighters never created a meaningful counterattack. That performance was far cleaner than the later misfire against Kelly. The difference suggested Milhouse was dangerous, even when his theatrics occasionally sabotaged precision. Lynn could plan around a mage who sometimes overcomplicated attacks. He could not plan around someone fundamentally weak. The distinction kept Milhouse in the role of Team Nuke rather than Team Liability. Lynn came outside, recognized both attackers, and summoned Ashera for interrogation work. Her confidence vanished briefly when she sensed Milhouse's spiritual pressure. The legendary gnome felt comparable to forces Ashera considered terrifyingly high within the spirit realm. Lynn ordered her to bind Dio and Scott using the Whip of Desire. Dio immediately begged, claimed he had only followed orders, and offered information in exchange for mercy. Lynn pointed out that regret after failure was not the same as regret before trying to murder his family. Ashera repeatedly applied the desire effect until both prisoners developed heart-shaped marks in their eyes. The low-probability skill had eventually succeeded exactly as Lynn predicted. Dio and Scott became desert slaves loyal to Ashera, and therefore obedient to Lynn through the summoning relationship. The process nearly emptied Lynn's remaining spirit and confirmed another complication. The spirit committed to maintaining pack summons such as Milhouse did not recover quickly after use. His already small magical capacity was now squeezed by permanent assets and active native summons. That problem could wait until the prisoners answered questions. Dio revealed Kelly's 300 gold bounty and the Silver Hand's need for a rookie summoner in a mysterious ritual. Every other available summoner apparently had protectors too dangerous to provoke. The organization selected Lynn because they thought a farmer's son had no meaningful backing. That assumption had just placed two of their contractors under his control. Lynn searched both prisoners and recovered only a few gold from Dio despite decades of adventuring. Dio explained that his philosophy prioritized immediate pleasure over saving for a future he might never survive to enjoy. Lynn judged the explanation economically disastrous, but consistent with the man's history. Scott kept more money through an account controlled by the Viper Gang, giving Lynn a possible future target if needed. The immediate enemy list mattered more. Darahart remained the long-term revenge target, but his tier and royal protection made attacking now suicidal. The Silver Hand had already tried to kidnap Lynn's family home and could strike again at any time. Lynn decided not to wait for another attempt. Dio had been hired to deliver him directly to Kelly, so Lynn ordered the new slave to complete the job. Dio initially failed even to tie a rope around Lynn, because the Desire Mark interpreted the action as harm against his master. Milhouse solved the problem by creating an arcane binding that looked secure, while allowing Lynn to break free instantly on command. The gnome also hid the loophole from anyone inspecting the rope casually. Lynn praised the spell and offered Milhouse another incentive. Tonight could establish his reputation in an entirely new world. For a mage remembered as a joke in parts of Azeroth, the idea of a clean slate mattered more than Lynn expected. Milhouse agreed enthusiastically. Lynn's counterattack would use the appearance of helplessness as a weapon. Dio would walk the supposedly captured summoner into the Silver Hand camp. Milhouse would remain hidden nearby. The Twilight Whelp would wait in the void, and Lynn would learn what the organization actually wanted. If negotiation revealed only ordinary greed, he could adapt. If the ritual proved as sinister as Dio suggested, Lynn intended to destroy the operation from inside. Night covered the Silver Hand camp, while workers continued building a permanent base near Mist City. Lynn entered tied in arcane rope, looking like Dio's helpless prisoner, while his real weapons moved unseen around him. The Twilight Whelp remained phased into the void. Milhouse stood in plain sight under a psychological concealment spell that made nearby mines simply refuse to register him. Lynn had never seen that trick on a Hearthstone card, further confirming that imported characters carried their wider lore with them. The staged kidnapping depended on an unusual advantage Lynn had never expected from Whip of Desire. Dio's memories survived conversion. He still knew how Kelly spoke, where to enter camp, what payment had been promised, and how to behave like the same selfish veteran everyone recognized. Only the direction of his loyalty had changed. That made him much more useful than an empty puppet. Scott served the same purpose as a criminal contact, who now had no incentive to betray Lynn. The arcane rope also showed why Milhouse's intelligence mattered outside raw spell damage. A convincing prisoner could not arrive with obviously fake restraints. The binding needed to survive inspection, restrict Lynn enough to look authentic, and still release immediately when he chose to act. Milhouse solved all three conditions with a casual spell. His psychological invisibility was even more unsettling. Normal invisibility hid light. This technique left the gnome physically present, while other minds edited him out of attention. People could look directly toward him and simply fail to assign importance to what they saw. Lynn began cataloging these unprinted abilities as seriously as the official skill panel. The panel showed what the system considered core. Experience showed what the character actually knew. Kelly's camp reinforced why both sources of information mattered. The plan would have failed if Milhouse were only the badly designed Hearthstone card Lynn remembered. Instead, the gnome entered an enemy base unseen and stood close enough to erase its vice captain whenever Lynn gave the signal. That security allowed Lynn to investigate before attacking. He needed to know whether the Silver Hand wanted money, a contract, a summon, or something larger. Walking away after killing Kelly without seeing the documents would have left the White Lotus connection hidden. The dangerous part of the plan was therefore not combat. It was waiting long enough for the enemy to reveal why Lynn mattered. Inside the largest tent, Kelly was talking with a young shadow dancer named Gordon. Gordon had joined the Silver Hand because its leadership preached protection, trust, and punishment of evil. Kidnapping a teenager clearly violated every slogan he had been taught. Kelly reframed the abduction as an aggressive invitation and claimed the group was helping a poor summoner gain resources. She also lied that Lynn still had no summon, keeping the organization's real interest away from the idealistic recruit. Gordon disliked the explanation, but had not yet decided how far his distrust went. A runner announced that Dio had arrived with the target. The camp gates opened, and Lynn was brought directly toward Kelly, while dozens of adventurers continued their work nearby. The location was isolated enough that the Silver Hand expected no outside witnesses to whatever followed. Kelly waited at the main tent wearing silver equipment and the confidence of someone who believed the operation was already finished. Her expression softened unexpectedly once she got a close look at the supposedly helpless prisoner. Lynn's absurd charisma produced another inconvenient effect. Instead of seeing merchandise, Kelly began reacting to his appearance emotionally. Gordon stared too, although his reaction was mostly confusion that someone his age could look that striking. Dio demanded the promised 300 gold before handing over the captive. Kelly's interest in Lynn vanished long enough for contempt toward her hired contractor to return. She released Tier 4 pressure and asked why a man like Dio deserved such an enormous payment, now that the target was already inside her camp. The organization had planned to cheat its own kidnapper from the beginning. Gordon immediately objected because a promise was still a promise, even when the person receiving money was unpleasant. Kelly attempted to justify the betrayal as reasonable pricing for an easy job. After enough moral pressure from Gordon, she handed Dio a tiny fraction of the agreed sum and called it an installment. Dio had already spent more hiring Scott than Kelly now paid him. The irony might have enraged him under normal circumstances. As Lynn's slave, however, he cared far more about the moment Kelly discovered who had actually walked into the trap. Dio left on Lynn's silent signal. Kelly turned her attention back to the bound teenager and tried treating the kidnapping like a generous recruitment meeting. She claimed a gold-rank mercenary group could offer safety and resources far beyond anything a farmer's family possessed. Lynn played frightened and refused. The performance encouraged Kelly's belief that she controlled every variable in the tent. She suggested delaying serious business until morning and made a personal advance Lynn had no intention of entertaining. He insisted on seeing the real terms immediately. Kelly produced a formal contract stamped with a symbol showing a triangle and an eye. Most clauses appeared ordinary. The Silver Hand funded summon development, while Lynn served the organization in exchange. Then Lynn reached the final requirement. The summoner had to enter the spirit realm twice every day and recite material selected by the guild leader. Kelly handed him the required text. 3 Chinese characters at the top turned the entire operation from suspicious into terrifying. The document was called the White Lotus Sutra. Chinese did not belong in this world's known languages. Yet Lynn could read every line because of his previous life on Earth. For the first time since reincarnation, he found direct evidence that someone else from his old world had influenced this one. The material also explained why the Silver Hand needed a summoner specifically. Whatever the scripture did, its ritual depended on being spoken inside the spirit realm. Kelly assumed he could not understand the characters and offered a phonetic guide. Lynn pretended to admire the writing, while secretly reading the original text perfectly. An illustration showed a serene Eastern woman seated on a lotus in the pose of a holy figure. The title beneath identified her as the Great Merciful Lotus-born Bodhisattva, a name unfamiliar to Lynn's memories of Buddhism. Something about the image felt wrong before anything supernatural even happened. Then the printed face smiled. Lynn kept his expression controlled while every survival instinct warned him that the page was not merely ink. The accompanying scripture followed the shape of classic recruitment propaganda. It emphasized suffering, blamed existing rulers, and presented the lotus-born figure as the single compassionate savior. The language mixed religious traditions in ways that felt manufactured rather than sincere. Lynn now suspected a cult created by another transmigrator, or something that had learned Earth languages for its own purpose. Kelly watched his reaction closely and asked whether he could read the text. He lied without hesitation. She accepted the answer and moved to the final threat behind her supposedly charitable offer. The contract carried a divine seal, and breaking it after signing would bring punishment. Kelly reminded Lynn that he was only a farmer's son and ordered him to stop acting special because of one rare awakening. Lynn refused. She repeated the demand. Lynn refused again, using the same blunt rejection style Ashera had once used on him. Kelly finally abandoned the gentle act. She threatened to destroy his face, drag his parents into camp, and torture them if he continued resisting. Outside the tent, Gordon overheard enough to watch the last pieces of his faith in the Silver Hand collapse. For Lynn, the threat changed the operation from investigation into execution. He had already watched Emily lose both parents to supernatural cruelty. Anyone promising the same fate for his family no longer received diplomatic patience. Lynn raised one hand and summoned Glacial Shard. The tiny elemental looked almost harmless beside a Tier 4 knight. Its battle cry did not care about appearances. Freeze targeted Kelly and took effect as a game mechanic rather than a contest of raw magical strength. Silver aura erupted from her body, but the ice still locked her in place. A level 0 summoner had just immobilized a much stronger adventurer with one cheap card. Lynn called for Millhouse. The hidden gnome became visible. and immediately tried to make the entrance spectacular. He created an energy crystal for his core buff, then launched shadow and frost spells at the same time. The two trajectories interfered with each other and detonated impressively without actually hitting Kelly. Lynn stared at the legendary mage in disbelief. Milhouse had brought the same chaotic incompetence that made his Warcraft reputation so entertaining when it happened to other people. Embarrassed, the gnome simplified the next attack. A concentrated shadow bolt struck Kelly directly. Corrosive darkness flooded through her defenses, while she remained frozen and unable to reposition. The vice captain began alternating threats with desperate apologies as soon as real pain replaced confidence. Lynn discovered another problem at the worst time. Milhouse and Glacial Shard now occupied all 3 points of his current spirit capacity. He could not summon a Shera to convert Kelly into a desire slave. Instead, interrogation would depend on fear. Lynn asked where the camp stored its money, valuables, records, and restricted material. Milhouse held another spell near Kelly's head while she provided locations, access details, and inventories. She begged the gnome for mercy because she assumed the most powerful person present had to be in command. Milhouse rejected the offer and pointed toward Lynn. Kelly's expression changed completely when she understood the level 0 summoner was ordering the terrifying mage. The supposed helpless farm boy had entered her camp voluntarily, with an archmage-level weapon hidden beside him. Kelly crawled toward Lynn and begged for her life in full view of the tent entrance. By now, other Silver Hand members had gathered outside. They watched their vice captain grovel before the teenager she had ordered kidnapped earlier that night. Lynn reminded Kelly of the threats against his parents and rejected the sudden claim that her words had meant nothing. One guardian knight stepped forward and argued that humiliating her was unnecessary, even if execution was justified. He also warned that Kelly's noble family could retaliate. Lynn asked a simpler question: who had kidnapped whom? The Silver Hand had taken him from his home, threatened civilians, and tried to force a cult contract onto him. Before the knight found an answer, Milhouse cast an instant fire spell. The defensive fighter died so quickly that the entire camp understood the difference in power without needing another demonstration. Around 200 adventurers became silent at once. Nobody else challenged Lynn while Milhouse stood beside him. Kelly was bound to a fir tree at the edge of camp, with the lingering shadow bolt corruption still eating through her body. The damage was expected to become fatal by morning. Lynn refused her request for a cleaner death. Kidnapping alone might have produced a different response. The cult scripture, an explicit threat against his parents, removed whatever mercy remained. Gordon stepped forward before the camp could disperse. The 16-year-old shadow dancer denounced Kelly's kidnapping, broken promises, and threats against civilians in front of everyone. He also condemned the members who had repeated the group's moral slogans but stood silently once power exposed the hypocrisy. Gordon formally quit the Silver Hand on the spot. No one tried to stop him, suggesting the young recruit had a background even the mercenary group hesitated to provoke. He volunteered to secure Kelly to the tree and produced knots advanced enough to earn confused looks from Lynn. By morning, every person leaving camp would see what happened to the vice captain. Lynn wanted the display to serve 2 purposes. First, future enemies needed to understand that attacking his family carried a cost. Second, whoever stood behind the White Lotus Sutra needed to notice that their summoner pipeline had just been disrupted. A secret cult connected to Earth was more dangerous than a single mercenary officer. Lynn preferred forcing that hidden power to react, while he was actively preparing rather than remaining ignorant. The Silver Hand's wealth was confiscated before Lynn left. Money, equipment, documents, and anything tied to the ritual became either resources or evidence. Far away, Damien was suffering a very different kind of crisis inside his family's luxurious home. Greenwood had ended the runaway adventure and expected his son to return to normal merchant life. Damien looked miserable until his father unexpectedly announced that Miss City would open the following month. If Damien reached Tier 1 before then, Greenwood would personally bring him back to Maple Leaf Town. The decision came from larger political concerns rather than sympathy for adventure fever. New job classes had begun appearing along the eastern continent, including Taoists, monks, and martial artists unknown to the established system. Every recognized class drew authority from a god. Entirely new classes implied that new divine powers had entered the world. Greenwood feared this could be the opening movement of a future god war. The new class reports also made Lynn's White Lotus problem harder to isolate from world events. Taoist, monk, and martial artist paths resembled traditions from Earth closely enough to deserve attention. Greenwood interpreted them through divine mechanics. No class could appear without authority behind it. If several unfamiliar classes emerged together, several new gods or one new divine system might have arrived at once. That raised a disturbing possibility. Earth-like language and Earth-like religious concepts could be appearing in more than one place simultaneously. The White Lotus Sutra might not be an isolated relic left by one old transmigrator. It could be part of a wider change already altering the world's class structure. Lynn had no evidence strong enough to connect those events yet. He simply added the coincidence to the growing list of questions that made blind assumptions dangerous. Whether conflict began immediately or decades later, he wanted Damien strong enough to survive instability. Damien absorbed almost none of the geopolitical seriousness and focused on the possibility of fighting interesting new classes. Greenwood had accidentally turned an apocalyptic warning into training motivation. Back in Maple Leaf Town, Lynn discovered that destroying Kelly had made him famous in exactly the wrong way. Emily reported gossip portraying him as a beautiful but merciless summoner who humiliated powerful women. She tried to sound concerned and failed to hide some satisfaction that other women had not impressed him. Lynn explained again that Kelly had threatened his parents after ordering his kidnapping. Emily remembered the corpse outside the camp and agreed that the vice captain had chosen her own consequences. The Starfruit Tavern became a center for increasingly distorted stories. People cared less about a gnome deleting experienced adventurers than about a handsome teenager rejecting and humiliating an attractive vice captain. Lynn accumulated several terrible nicknames overnight. Some focused on Kelly's ruined clothing, some on his appearance, and one implied that he was merely a powerful mage's pretty companion. Only Ice Splitter, earned from freezing Kelly with glacial shards, sounded remotely respectable. Maple Leaf Town's gossip also distorted Lynn's deterrence strategy in ways he could not control. He wanted enemies to remember that kidnapping him ended with Kelly destroyed. The public preferred debating his face, Kelly's beauty, and whether a powerful mage was secretly supporting him for romantic reasons. Titles such as Clothes Ripper, Beauty Abuser, Mage's Pretty Boy, and Jade-Faced Thug spread faster than the actual tactical facts. Ice Splitter was the only nickname Lynn could tolerate because it pointed to a real ability. The absurd names irritated him, but they also proved something useful. His identity was now memorable. A criminal, considering another easy abduction, would hear those stories before reaching the farmhouse. Even bad fame could contribute to deterrence when the underlying event remained frightening enough. The local newspaper made the problem worse. One article openly speculated that Lynn and Milhouse had a romantic relationship because nobody could imagine another reason for a mighty mage to support a farmer's son. Lynn nearly destroyed the paper, while Milhouse treated the rumor as an insult to his magical greatness. The publication rated Milhouse far more seriously in its combat section. Witnesses estimated him around Tier 6 after seeing Shadowbolt cripple Kelly and instant fire magic erase a Guardian Knight. His concealment was interpreted as calculated tactical caution rather than simple obedience to Lynn's ambush plan. The assessment called him extremely dangerous. Lynn's own profile was much less flattering. It noted the summoner class, his low level, glacial shard, and Kelly's defeat, but treated Milhouse as the real foundation of his reputation. That irritated Lynn, even though the conclusion was currently fair. In Noah Capital, Kelly's death produced consequences beyond gossip. Her consorti family belonged to the kingdom's old nobility and commanded the Eagle Knight Order. The consorti retaliation threat carried another lesson about visibility. Lynn had deliberately made Kelly's defeat public so future kidnappers would hesitate. Public deterrence also guaranteed that powerful relatives would hear every humiliating detail. Strength solved the immediate problem and created a political one. That trade-off did not make the decision wrong. It simply meant Lynn could no longer pretend he was an anonymous bronze adventurer. Noble families, cult networks, newspapers, and professional diviners had all begun placing his name into their own calculations. The Hearthstone system was pulling him upward faster than his social position could adjust. A farmer's son with hidden power could be ignored. A farmer's son who publicly destroyed noble-connected mercenaries became a question important people wanted answered. The family patriarch, Dylan, cared as much about the public humiliation as the actual death. A quiet killing could have been answered privately. A vice captain displayed before hundreds of witnesses challenged the prestige of the entire bloodline. Investigators found almost nothing about Milhouse. No school record, guild history, noble registration, or known teacher connected to the gnome. A mage estimated at such a high tier should not have been able to appear without a trace. Dylan called an astrologer capable of divining information through a crystal medium. The divination did not produce the clean answer he expected. The crystal cracked apart while projecting Milhouse's arrogant voice and an impossible vision of the gnome surrounded by collapsing stars. Whether the image represented truth, symbolic interference, or the Hearthstone system protecting him, did not matter to the astrologer. The professional diviner left without collecting payment. The failed divination on Millhouse produced a reputation completely disconnected from the gnome. Lynn actually knew. Dylan expected a crystal to reveal teacher origin, location, or weakness. Instead, the tool shattered after presenting an impossible cosmic scene with Millhouse standing against collapsing stars. The gnome's own voice mocked the attempt through the failing vision. Nobody at the Consortia estate had context for Warcraft, dimensional travel, or Hearthstone cards. They saw only a hidden mage so dangerous that professional divination broke while observing him. The astrologer refusing payment amplified the fear. A fortune teller walking away from money communicated more danger than any official report could have. Lynn would have laughed if he knew the same terrifying mystery figure once ruined an ultimate attack because a creature interrupted him at the wrong moment. Millhouse's greatest defensive asset might currently be the distance between his reputation and his actual personality. Dylan remained behind with far more fear than useful information. Lynn knew nothing about the failed scrying and spent the morning counting what he had taken from the silver hand. The total reached several hundred gold, while Kelly's enchanted armor and great sword were worth even more. His weekly card pack problem had transformed from impossible to funded for multiple cycles. Violence had become profitable only because the people he robbed had started the conflict by trying to own him. The White Lotus Sutra mattered more than money. Repeated reading confirmed a bizarre mixture of Chinese folk ideas, Buddhist presentation, and references to the Abrahamic God. The combination looked like deliberate cult synthesis, rather than any religion Lynn knew from Earth. The White Lotus material frightened Lynn because too many separate clues aligned at once. Chinese writing required either someone from Earth or some entity with direct access to Earth culture. A spirit realm chanting requirement connected the scripture to the exact dimension native summoners used for contracts. The moving image proved the book carried active supernatural influence rather than merely ideological propaganda. The divine contract seal suggested at least one recognized god or godlike authority could enforce participation. And the silver hand needed a rookie summoner with weak family backing badly enough to pay hundreds of gold for abduction. None of those facts made sense as ordinary mercenary recruitment. Lynn also noticed the text structure because he had seen manipulative messaging before. It began with real suffering people could recognize. It moved blame toward existing elites. Then it inserted the Lotus-born figure as the compassionate answer to everything. That did not prove the established nobles were good. Derahart was living evidence that many powerful people were monstrous. The manipulation came from using genuine injustice to demand obedience to an unknown savior. Lynn's life on Earth gave him enough historical context to distrust that pattern immediately. The reference to the Abrahamic God made the document even stranger. Buddhist imagery, Chinese religious language, and Christian terminology had been blended inside one fantasy world cult text. Someone was combining traditions rather than preserving one. Lynn could not tell whether the creator was a transmigrator, an imitator, or something older using borrowed symbols. That uncertainty was why he lied about reading Chinese. If Kelly knew he understood the original language, she might report that fact to whoever created the scripture. Lynn preferred to choose when the hidden organization learned another person from Earth existed. He still had no answer for who created it or how another Earth language entered this world. Finding the Silver Hand's true leader became a long-term objective. The immediate crisis was more mundane and more dangerous to Lynn personally. His spirit remained effectively occupied. Pack summons and active cards had consumed the tiny pool he depended on for every magical action. He needed a meditation technique before the class system became stronger than the summoner using it. Caster classes expanded spirit through structured meditation, but even the cheapest manual at the Guild Exchange required significant adventure points. Lynn had nowhere near enough, so despite suddenly holding hundreds of gold, he still needed to grind quests like a rookie. Money and progression had become separate currencies. At the Guild, Branch President Rushu was dealing with a request from Violet Academy. The kingdom's only major mage school planned to send apprentices to Maple Leaf Town for a week of practical combat experience. Rushu had to provide suitable adventurer mentors, while Miss City was already flooding the region with risk. One student file made the assignment much harder. Orixia was officially a berserker despite attending a mage academy. Her race explained the contradiction. She was half-dragon and inherited natural magical aptitude independent of class. The academy headmaster warned that Orixia was difficult to control and required someone genuinely strong. Rushu rejected one potential escort team after another. Soon, a high-paying Violet Academy internship appeared on the guild mission board. The job required either a silver-rank adventurer or a qualified bronze-rank team. The reward included substantial gold and enough adventure points to transform Lynn's progression. The Violet Academy mission offered exactly the kind of opportunity Lynn needed at this stage. Gold solved the expensive side of the Hearthstone system. Adventure points unlocked local techniques his cards could not replace. Mentoring apprentices also created contact with the kingdom's largest concentration of young mages. That network might eventually help Milhouse study local magic, or reveal information about classes and gods. The hidden risk was Orixia. A half-dragon could recognize things in Lynn's summons that ordinary humans missed. The Twilight Whelp already carried void properties Lewis detected immediately. Taragosa, once summoned, would bring blue dragon traits from another world entirely. Keeping dragon secrets around someone with draconic blood could become much harder than hiding them from Damien. Rushu probably understood at least part of that risk and still looked delighted to assign the team. Lynn filed the president's amusement under another reason, to stay suspicious of old powerful men with too much free time. When Lynn saw the posting, he immediately wanted it. The receptionist immediately rejected his solo application because his bronze rank did not meet the requirement. That left one route: create an adventurer team. Lynn mentally counted the people already under his influence. There was himself, Milhouse, Dio, and Scott. Future card pack legendaries could expand the roster indefinitely, but registration required members right now. He chose the name Hearthstone Legends before checking whether anyone else considered it embarrassing. Pierre explained that a recognized team needed at least 5 awakened members and a registration fee. Lynn had 4. A familiar voice offered to become the 5th. Gordon had left the Silver Hand and now stood behind him with the same serious expression he wore while condemning Kelly. Lynn immediately greeted him with a terrible nickname, circulating after his sophisticated knot work. Gordon's face turned bright red, giving Lynn the rare pleasure of watching someone else suffer from local gossip. Before joining, Gordon asked what philosophy the new team would follow. The question mattered deeply after the Silver Hand used noble slogans to conceal corruption. Lynn considered the future recruits he might summon from Warcraft characters with incompatible politics, cultures, and moral beliefs. Forcing all of them under one grand doctrine would eventually become dishonest, so he offered a simpler rule. Each member could act according to personal conscience and speak what they believed, but no member could harm another teammate over those differences. No fake creed promised universal goodness. No blind loyalty replaced judgment. The structure depended on individuals choosing cooperation without pretending they were identical. Gordon's decision to leave the Silver Hand also mattered for more than filling a registration form later. He had joined because he wanted an organization that matched the moral language it advertised. Kelly forced him to watch each principle collapse in sequence. First came kidnapping, then came dishonesty about payment, then came contempt for poor families. Finally came explicit threats to torture civilians. By the time Lynn attacked, Gordon was not changing sides because the stronger person won. He was rejecting an institution that had failed its own stated standard. That history explained why he later asked the Hearthstone Legends for a philosophy before agreeing to join. A second beautiful slogan would have meant nothing. Lynn's answer worked because it refused to promise moral perfection. Do what you believe is right, placed responsibility on each member, instead of hiding decisions behind leadership. Say what you believe is true, made disagreement acceptable. The prohibition against teammates harming one another created the minimum structure required to keep incompatible people together. For Gordon, that was more credible than a polished motto about justice. For Lynn, it was also preparation for future Warcraft recruits. Some legendary figures he hoped to summon had spent their original lives on opposite sides of wars, trying to force alliance heroes, horde leaders, undead rulers, paladins, warlocks, and dragons into one ideology would be absurd. Cooperation needed rules narrow enough to survive genuine disagreement. The founding roster looked ridiculous on paper, but the principle was built for a much larger future. Gordon accepted immediately. The Hearthstone Legends has now had 5 founding members. Lynn led as the summoner and strategist. Milhouse provided overwhelming magic, and Scott supplied basic frontline and rogue experience under their desire marks. Gordon became the unpredictable young prodigy who had walked away from his first organization on principle. Pierre sent the application upstairs for expedited review. Rushu initially hated the team's name and dismissed the low-tier members as unimpressive. Then he reached Milhouse. An unknown mage estimated above Tier 6 changed the entire evaluation. Pierre summarized what had happened to Kelly and the Guardian Knight. Rushu stopped complaining and ordered the new team brought into his office immediately. Rushu looked nothing like the comfortable administrator Lynn expected from a branch president. The old man was wiry, scarred across one eye, and carried physical pressure comparable to the monstrous fighter Gus. He introduced himself as a gladiator, a class famous for direct one-on-one combat. Lynn immediately understood that Maple Leaf Town hid far more dangerous people than its farming reputation suggested. Milhouse responded by climbing onto the desk so the seated president could not look down on him physically. The gnome announced that Rushu was respectable, but still beneath the great Milhouse. Instead of taking offense, Rushu laughed because he could feel enough magical pressure to know the boast was not empty. He promised to approve the Hearthstone legends immediately. Then the real reason for the private meeting appeared. Rushu wanted Lynn's new team to mentor the incoming Violet Academy students. Lynn had already wanted the public quest, but a guild president personally pushing it suggested a hidden problem. He asked for the catch before accepting. Rushu admitted that most apprentices were ordinary students, while one particular girl needed unusually strong supervision. The phrase difficult student sounded far more dangerous after Lynn had seen the half-dragon file requirement indirectly shaping the quest. He began pretending the new team should focus on internal bonding instead. Rushu raised the compensation immediately. The revised offer paid 200 gold per day and 500 adventure points for the week. That amount could buy Lynn a far better meditation method than the basic exchange option. Lynn still pressed once more by mentioning that he had awakened as a summoner without even owning a proper meditation technique. Rushu glanced at Milhouse as though asking how that sentence could possibly be true. Then he offered a manual from his personal collection as an immediate signing bonus. No grinding, no waiting, and no separate purchase. Lynn checked Gordon because the other human members were either bound servants or the gnome already interested in the assignment. Gordon agreed. The deal was accepted. Rushu exhaled with suspicious relief, confirming that Orixia was going to be much more than mildly troublesome. Pierre arrived with the official team rating soon afterward. The Hearthstone Legends received silver rank from the beginning. Milhouse's estimated power dragged the average upwards so dramatically that several level 0 and tier 1 members no longer mattered to the score. One legendary gnome had effectively carried an entire organization through placement. The new team registration also changed Lynn's personal status interface. A Hearthstone Legends section appeared with detailed member information and loyalty values. Dio's panel showed an ordinary tier 1 warrior with decent strength and completely locked loyalty through the desire mark. Scott looked similarly limited. Then Lynn opened Gordon's information. The teenager had 2 jobs. Shadow Dancer was only the first. The second hidden class was Corpse Collector. Together they gave Gordon 4 specialty attributes across physical and spiritual growth. That same 4 specialty structure was associated with legendary hero classes at the highest end of this world's talent system. Gordon had been walking around like an earnest rookie, while carrying an architecture almost nobody else possessed. His raw attributes already exceeded Dio's total, despite the veteran's years of field experience. The Shadow Dancer class provided several abilities designed to chain together. One damaged and distorted perception through shadow effects. Another delivered rapid movement while slowing enemies. A passive triggered additional shadow damage after consecutive skill use. Most level 0 classes began with far less synergy. Corpse Collector looked simpler but potentially more dangerous. By collecting a corpse, Gordon could randomly obtain fragments of the dead person's memories. A fallen swordsman might provide technique. A dead mage might leave behind spell knowledge. Repeated exposure to powerful corpses could turn that one skill into an expanding library of other people's experience. Lynn immediately locked the information away, instead of announcing Gordon's secrets to the room. The teenager already trusted him more than expected after only a few days. That trust was something Lynn intended to keep rather than exploit carelessly. Gordon's hidden second class made that future even more interesting. Corpse Collector did not guarantee a useful memory every time. The randomness meant most bodies might provide fragments too small or irrelevant to matter. But the ceiling was enormous, because the input pool was every dead person Gordon could legally or illegally collect. A lifetime of battlefields could expose him to techniques from warriors, mages, assassins, craftsmen, scholars, and monsters. Even incomplete memories could reveal how an enemy trained or why a technique failed. Combined with Shadow Dancer's mobility, Gordon already had a strong combat class before Corpse Collector contributed anything. Lynn therefore saw no reason to rush the death ability recklessly. The boy was valuable without turning every corpse into an experiment. The loyalty score mattered too. Desire marks locked Dio and Scott at artificial obedience. Gordon's loyalty came from personal approval and could rise or fall according to Lynn's behavior. That made it less secure and much more meaningful. If the Hearthstone Legends eventually filled with intelligent pack characters, Lynn expected those relationships to work the same way. Command authority could force some actions through summoning contracts. Trust would decide whether powerful people actually wanted his plans to succeed. Rushu finally brought out the promised meditation options. Instead of ordinary books, he presented 3 mystical paintings. Meditation worked by reproducing a structured image inside the mind until the pattern expanded spiritual capacity. The first painting showed a tiny fisherman surviving a violent ocean while something enormous waited beneath the surface. The second depicted a white tower piercing storm clouds, covered in yellow eyes while lightning struck the peak. The third showed a dragon impaled on an ancient battlefield as humans crawled around its dying body. Each image pushed back against Lynn when he tried to copy it mentally. These were not pictures to memorize with normal eyesight. The patterns behaved like magical structures that resisted incomplete understanding. Milhouse quietly pulled Lynn aside after studying them for only a few minutes. The gnome had already memorized all 3. Lynn initially assumed he was exaggerating until Milhouse described details Lynn had barely managed to observe. He ranked the White Tower as the most complicated because reproducing it had taken the longest. The ocean came second. The dead dragon was easiest and therefore probably lowest quality. Milhouse also believed he could reconstruct copies later after understanding the system better. That promise made Lynn want to protect the gnome with every resource available. Rushu recommended the dragon painting as a safer beginner option. The suggestion only convinced Lynn that the tower was the prize Rushu least wanted to surrender. He selected the White Tower. Rushu identified it as the Tower of Knowledge and warned that its mental inscription was extremely difficult. Rushu's choice of the Tower of Knowledge also carried a quiet test. He knew Lynn had been a summoner for less than a month and had never used formal meditation. Recommending the easier dragon painting would have been responsible for an ordinary beginner. Lynn deliberately chose the harder image because Milhouse could compare all 3 from a mage's perspective. That partnership let him take risks local beginners could not justify. If the tower proved too difficult, Lynn still had a legendary researcher beside him who had already memorized the alternatives. The decision was therefore aggressive without being blind. Rushu saw only a stubborn young summoner choosing his most valuable painting. Lynn saw access to all 3 eventually. Assuming Milhouse's reverse engineering succeeded, Lynn kept the choice. Somewhere else, Violet Academy students were receiving news that the coming combat internship would affect whether they advanced to the next year. Failure meant repeating coursework, and repeated failures could lead to expulsion. The announcement created immediate panic among apprentices who knew theory far better than field survival. 2 top-ranked students reacted with much less concern. Hera, a small gray-haired girl with a love of romance stories, was more interested in whether the internship might provide an attractive adventurer teacher. Her best friend Orixia had no patience for the fantasy. Orixia was the half-red dragon berserker Rushu had been struggling to place. She carried orange-red eyes, strong draconic blood, and enough family pressure that even her future marriage was expected to stay within dragon circles. Hera continued imagining a tragic romance with some clean-faced young instructor. Orixia dismissed the idea because adventurers usually looked sunburned, rough, and nothing like Hera's preferred type. Neither girl knew the assigned team was led by Lynn. The situation became even more ironic because Lynn's secret summon was a dragon species Orixia had never seen. Back in Maple Leaf Town, Milhouse asked for access to local mages who could explain this world's magical traditions. The request made strategic sense. The gnome had mastered Azeroth systems, but meditation and divine classes introduced entirely different structures. Lewis was already chasing Shadow City through a dangerous desert. The Violet Academy apprentices were too inexperienced to challenge Milhouse intellectually. That left Florina, the powerful owner of the Starfruit Tavern. Emily's relationship with her created a natural introduction. Lynn arranged the meeting and quickly regretted trying to follow the conversation. Within minutes, Milhouse and Florina were discussing magical principles using vocabulary that meant almost nothing to him. Their debate moved through spiritual structure, conversion, rejection, and forces Lynn could not translate into useful battlefield decisions. He left the 2 mages happily arguing and went home to begin Tower of Knowledge training. The first attempt had nearly overwhelmed him when he tried building the mental image from the top. This time, Lynn started at the base. The lower structure formed more smoothly. As concentration deepened, the tower changed inside his mind into layers resembling stacked books. The many yellow eyes transformed into something like markers resting between those layers. The altered interpretation felt natural, even though the original painting showed nothing of the kind. Then Lynn reached the lightning at the peak. The meditation stopped feeling like imagination. His body became the tower in his perception, and the lightning struck through him with full sensory pain. Sweat soaked his clothes while every instinct demanded he stop. Stopping would lose the incomplete structure and force another attempt from the beginning. Lynn endured until the final element locked into place. When he opened his eyes, dawn had already arrived. An entire night had disappeared, while he believed only a fraction of that time had passed. His spirit capacity had increased by a small amount. The Tower of Knowledge also appeared as a high-quality meditation skill, with its own progression meter. Compared with Collection, the new skill carried a much higher rank and correspondingly harsher learning curve. Lynn had spent hours being mentally electrocuted for a tiny increase. The Hearthstone system had given him game mechanics without removing the need to grind. Over the following days, he repeated the meditation obsessively. Milhouse practiced the same system beside him with infuriating ease. The gnome needed only short sessions, no visible painting, and gained spirit much faster. When Lynn demanded an explanation, Milhouse gave useless instructions and blamed the difference on superior gnome talent. The comparison hurt. The Tower of Knowledge also revealed that meditation was not simply sitting still and breathing. The painting acted like a compressed magical idea. Copying the shape meant reproducing relationships between symbols, pressure, movement, and meaning inside the mind. That was why normal photographic memory would not be enough for Lynn. Milhouse, however, possessed both extraordinary spirit and a mage's habit of analyzing magical structures directly. He did not merely remember what the three paintings looked like. He remembered how they were built. His claim that he could reproduce them later therefore threatened the entire economics of rare meditation art. A painting Rushu guarded as a personal treasure could become copyable knowledge once Milhouse understood the mechanism. Lynn had no immediate plan to abuse that possibility, but he recognized its value. The gnome's fascination with local magic was becoming a progression path of its own. Azeroth's spells gave him an enormous starting toolkit. This world's meditation could increase the resource supporting those spells. Florina's theories could teach him principles absent from Azeroth. If Milhouse successfully combined both traditions, the joke legendary Lynn pulled from a bad card could evolve beyond either original system. That possibility was one reason Lynn tolerated the ego, the noise, and the occasional catastrophic accuracy problem. A powerful weapon was useful. A powerful researcher who could improve himself indefinitely was much more dangerous. Lynn's spirit increased by fractions, while Milhouse climbed from 45 toward 50 in only a couple of days. Still, Lynn's Tower of Knowledge meter advanced steadily toward its first level. Every successful session made the next attempt slightly more familiar. Elsewhere, Damien had been attacking his own progression problem with the full financial force of Radiant Moon. Greenwood provided enchanted training dummies that fought back rather than standing still. Damien destroyed several during one sword technique, turning a few seconds of practice into an expense that could have funded Lynn for weeks. After training came medicinal baths made from rare ingredients and personalized preparation. The daily cost reached amounts Lynn would consider life-changing wealth. The spending was outrageous, but the results were real. Damien's forced return home did not turn him into a passive rich heir. Greenwood's condition gave the boy a measurable target, and Damien attacked it with every advantage money could buy. The training dummies could dodge, counter, and strike back like real opponents. Destroying one meant the exercise had actually overcome responsive magic, rather than hitting a stationary object. Damien destroyed several at once with his family's sunsword technique. Each broken construct cost enough to make servants visibly distressed. Then rare medicinal baths accelerated recovery, so he could repeat the punishment the next day. The routine cost thousands of gold daily. Lynn would have considered that budget enough to revolutionize his entire summoning career. For Damien, it was simply the family-approved path toward Tier 1. The contrast did not make Damien lazy. He worked hard enough to use every expensive tool placed in front of him. Wealth changed the speed and safety of training, not the amount of determination he brought to it. That was why Lynn increasingly treated the swordsman as more than a walking wallet. Damien pushed multiple attributes to the level 0 cap within days, and continued working on spirit for the Tier 1 breakthrough. His target was to advance before Mist City officially opened. The rich swordsman also remembered that Raven was a summoner, and began planning expensive spirit-related gifts for their reunion. Lynn remained completely unaware that someone in Noah Capital was budgeting presents worth more than his family property. At Violet Academy, Headmaster Kohler contacted Rushu to confirm whether a safe team had been found for Orixia. Rushu proudly mentioned the presence of a high-tier mage. Kohler then remembered an additional request from Orixia's mother. Her daughter was not supposed to become romantically involved with human boys during the internship. Kohler asked whether the powerful mage was handsome. Rushu answered with complete technical honesty that Milhouse was an older gnome. That satisfied the headmaster. Only after the crystal call ended did Rushu begin laughing. Kohler had never asked about the team leader. Rushu knew exactly what 20 charisma looked like. and anticipated the future misunderstanding with far too much enjoyment. The old gladiator had turned mentoring logistics into entertainment without technically lying to anyone. Milhouse, meanwhile, was gaining even more from his conversation with Florina. She found him impossible to categorize. He lacked basic knowledge children in this world learned early, yet solved advanced magical questions with principles completely foreign to local scholarship. That contradiction made Florina suspect the gnome came from somewhere far beyond ordinary education. Her instinct was close enough to the truth. To make Lynn grateful, Milhouse controlled what he revealed. Florina rewarded the exchange by offering legendary starfruit wine. A first drink could permanently increase a person's spirit capacity. Milhouse's suspicion vanished the instant he learned the benefit. More importantly, he requested a second serving for Lynn. The gnome remembered that his summoner desperately needed spirit, despite all their constant arguing. That small act made Lynn's investment in Milhouse feel increasingly personal rather than merely tactical. By the end of the second day, Lynn had pushed his meditation progress halfway toward the next level. The gain remained slow, but he could finally see a path forward. Sunday evening approached. That meant the third Hearthstone round was about to begin. Before sleeping, Emily returned from work with news that the adventurer influx had earned her a raise. Her eyes looked brighter than they had immediately after the funeral, and Lynn took that improvement as more important than the money. He patted her head without thinking, making her blush while she complained without actually moving away. For a moment, home felt normal again. Then Lynn went to bed expecting Bob's tavern. The dream opened somewhere else. Golden sky stretched above an endless field of clouds. The woman from the White Lotus Sutra floated in front of him with hands arranged in a sacred gesture. The lotus-born bodhisattva repeated a plea for mercy towards suffering people. At first, the voice sounded gentle. Then Lynn saw what lived behind her eyes. An ocean of blood and mountains of corpses replaced every trace of compassion. Blood tears ran down the woman's face, while the same sentence continued again and again. The chant began pressing directly against Lynn's mind. His mouth started shaping the words without permission. He nearly repeated the phrase before pain, and instinct warned him that doing so might complete whatever connection to the cult had wanted. Lynn struck his own face hard enough to interrupt the automatic response. The dream did not break. The lotus-born figure continued, trying to push the prayer into his consciousness. That meant simply reading the White Lotus Sutra had been enough for something to find him. The Lotus-born encounter also changed Lynn's understanding of the White Lotus contract retroactively. Kelly had required chanting inside the spirit realm every morning and evening. Lynn had merely read the scripture in the physical world and still attracted the entity into a dream. If repeated spirit realm recitation strengthened that connection, the Silver Hand might have been building something far more serious than a prayer habit. A rookie summoner could act as a bridge to creatures ordinary humans could not reach. Repeated chanting might create access, worship, energy, influence, or some other effect Lynn had not identified. The fact that Lynn's mouth started copying the phrase automatically suggested the process could become self-reinforcing. He had resisted only because the behavior felt foreign enough to trigger alarm. Someone who believed the scripture sincerely might welcome the same compulsion. That possibility made the cult more dangerous than a group of mercenaries reading strange religious material. It might be a mechanism for converting summoners into living channels. He had never performed the twice-daily spirit realm ritual, Kelly demanded. The connection had reached him anyway. Fear rapidly became anger. Lynn had survived a second life, built a class, protected Emily, and fought kidnappers only to have an unknown entity invade his sleep. He refused to offer reverence. Instead, Lynn answered in fluent Mandarin with an insult aimed directly at the bodhisattva's mother. The chanting stopped. The ancient-looking figure stared at him in visible confusion. Her holy composure broke so thoroughly that she paused the hand gesture and seemed unsure she had heard correctly. Lynn took immense satisfaction from confusing a cosmic cult figure with profanity from another world. Then the Hearthstone mark burned across his palm. A powerful force pulled his consciousness downward through darkness before the lotus-born figure recovered. Lynn did not resist because anything linked to Bob sounded safer than remaining in the golden sky. He landed inside the warm Hearthstone tavern. The fireplace, familiar counter, and Bob's bald head felt more comforting than any sacred vision could have. Bob greeted him and offered the familiar promise of support. In the game, that line often preceded terrible shop luck. Tonight, Lynn wondered whether the tavern had literally protected him from the invading dream. He asked how the weekly transition actually worked. The first visit required crossing a wasteland. The second sent him directly inside. The third had been intercepted by another entity before the Hearthstone mark dragged him to safety. Bob had no useful explanation. Lynn looked toward the closed tavern door and wondered what existed outside. The mystery could wait until he possessed enough power to survive discovering the answer. Round 3 shopping mattered now. Because of the previous upgrade, Bob displayed 5 choices instead of 4. Lynn's weekly coin cap had risen to 5, while upgrading again required more than he could currently exchange without selling something. Selling the Twilight Whelp for tempo was not acceptable, while taunt remained his best personal defense. So Lynn examined the shop first. Eternal Night offered scaling undead power every time copies of the same minion died. With enough recruits, the mechanic could produce an army that became stronger through casualties. The idea was dangerous and attractive, but not the immediate priority. Another economy minion offered spell discounts. A simple hungry creature scaled after repeated purchases. Then Lynn reached a silver-framed dragon card and stopped breathing normally. The name was Terracosa. Terracosa was a 2-star legendary dragon with balanced 4/4 combat stats and its deceptively powerful permanent growth effect. Any temporary stats or keywords she gained during combat would remain with her afterward, instead of disappearing when the fight ended. In a game, that mechanic was already useful. In reality, Lynn immediately imagined combining temporary buffs from multiple systems until they became permanent improvements on a respawning dragon. The name carried even more weight than the effect. Terracosa belonged to Azeroth's Blue Dragonflight, a race famous for magical talent far beyond ordinary mortal spellcasters. Her original story ended in sacrifice while opposing Deathwing, with her essence later connected to a legendary weapon. Lynn remembered that storyline clearly enough to feel something deeper than ordinary excitement. The character who died permanently in Warcraft could now exist as a tavern recruit that reset every weekly round. His system was not merely importing power. It might be giving dead legends another chance to live. That possibility ended the decision immediately. Lynn bought Terracosa for 3 tavern coins. 2 coins remained. The final shop option was a 2-coin spell called Recruiter Rookie, which generated a random 1-star minion. Lynn could not afford another normal recruit after purchasing Terracosa, so the spell converted his exact remaining budget into one more roll. He bought it. A new card appeared as Razorfin Diviner, a low-tier Quillbore whose battlecry produced 2 blood gems. Each blood gem could permanently increase a minion's attack and health by 1. The body itself was modest. The 2 free buffs were the real value. Lynn immediately pictured placing both gems on Twilight Whelp to extend the time taunt could protect him before Death Rattle triggered. More health on the first body meant more attacks redirected away from Lynn. That was exactly the kind of small defensive improvement that mattered more in reality than it ever did on a digital board. Bob approved the purchase with his usual cheerful confidence. For once, Lynn agreed without needing to reinterpret the line. The tavern shopping was complete, but one much more expensive ritual remained. Lynn had recovered enough gold from the Silver Hand to purchase his weekly card pack. 500 gold still felt obscene, even when he could finally afford it. That money represented more than his parents could imagine earning through farming. Now it was becoming 5 pieces of cardboard floating inside a dream tavern. Lynn understood perfectly why the price hurt and still handed Bob the gold. The system limited ordinary packs to 1 each week. Missing a week felt like permanently falling behind future possibilities, which made the purchase difficult to resist once funds existed. Lynn recognized the psychological trap because he had lived through digital card game monetization before. Recognizing it did not make him immune. He opened the pack anyway. No legendary light appeared this time. Statistics finally behaved normally after Millhouse's absurd first pack luck. The pack contained 1 rare card and 4 commons, but the actual utility was much better than the colors suggested. Amber Priestess immediately caught Lynn's attention. She was a 1/4 minion with taunt, and her battlecry healed an ally for an amount tied to her own health. The Hearthstone legends already had fighters, a rogue, a mage, a summoner, and several offensive options. What the group lacked was reliable healing. A durable priestess who could both stand in front and restore an ally filled a practical hole, rather than simply adding more damage. Her spirit cost was only 2, which meant Lynn could actually summon her once his occupied spirit problem improved. The second card was Headhunter's Axe. It dealt modest damage and carried limited durability, but controlling a beast could extend how long the weapon remained useful. That created a small synergy with Lynn's nature spell that could summon ghost wolves or hawks. The effect was not spectacular, yet Lynn had spent enough years with card games to respect combinations that improved resource efficiency. Murloc Tidehunter came next. Summoning it also produced an additional small Murloc body, giving 1 card multiple units on the field. Again, not world-breaking. Still, extra bodies could matter for scouting, blocking, distractions, or any future effect that counted minions rather than raw power. The rare card was Carrion Flaptrap. Its printed body was expensive and strange, but the effect was immediately interesting. The creature absorbed attack power from nearby minions that died. If this world's system counted monsters and summoned creatures as valid deaths, the plant could scale by simply existing near repeated battles. Lynn imagined carrying it through goblin hunts, dungeon fights, and larger wars, while every corpse fed its attack. That ceiling was enormous. The problem was the cost. Carrion Flaptrap required 7 spirit, more than double Lynn's current natural capacity. For now, it was another powerful card sitting behind a resource wall. The final card, Rest and Recuperate, was a holy spell that summoned 2 Silver Hand recruits protected by divine shields. The name made Lynn stop for a moment. In Azeroth, Silver Hand represented heroic paladins. In this world, an organization using the same words had just tried to kidnap him for a cult ritual. The coincidence was almost offensively ironic. Mechanically, the spell remained useful, because Divine Shield could block one otherwise lethal hit on each recruit. Lynn finished evaluating the pack and found himself surprisingly satisfied. There was no second legendary. There did not need to be. Amber Priestess solved healing. The axe introduced equipment synergy. Tidehunter created extra bodies. Carrion Flaptrap offered long-term scaling. Rest and Recuperate provided protected summons. The pack had expanded options rather than simply increasing one number. Combined with Tarek Gosa and Razorfin Diviner, Round 3 had been a strong progression cycle. More importantly, the entire tavern visit had confirmed that the Hearthstone space could interrupt outside supernatural influence. Lynn still did not know whether Bob, the birthmark, or the tavern itself had pulled him away from the Lotus-born Bodhisattva. He only knew the cult entity had reached him in a dream and then lost access once he entered this place. That made the weekly tavern more than a shop. It might also be one of the few protected spaces available against whatever intelligence stood behind the White Lotus Sutra. Lynn looked once more at Bob and the closed tavern door. Questions were multiplying faster than answers. Another transmigrator might exist. New gods were appearing on the continent. Mist City would soon open. Deerheart remained alive. The consort family had begun reacting to Kelly's death. The Violet Academy students were on their way. A half-dragon berserker would soon meet a team secretly carrying dragon summons. Millhouse was learning a second world's magic, while Florina encouraged the process. Lewis was traveling toward a returned ancient city with void essence in his possession. And somewhere beyond ordinary dreams, the Lotus-born Bodhisattva now knew Lynn could resist her chant. Every one of those threads could become dangerous. For the first time, Lynn also possessed enough resources that danger did not feel like the only thing growing. He had a silver rank team. He had a meditation path. He had native and Hearthstone summons. He had a legendary mage, whose potential looked far greater than his joke reputation. He had Taragosa waiting as a respawning legendary dragon. He had new cards that covered healing, defense, scaling, and utility. Most importantly, his parents and Emily now had a high-tier golem protecting the home he could not always guard personally. That protection gave Lynn room to take risks, without leaving everyone he loved completely exposed. The revenge against Deerheart was nowhere near ready. Lynn no longer confused anger with readiness. He needed spirit, levels, stronger tavern tiers, information about the White Lotus cult, and enough influence to survive royal retaliation afterward. For now, progression came first. The Hearthstone Tavern faded as the weekly visit ended. Lynn opened his eyes beneath the same uneven wooden ceiling he had stared at after every major breakthrough. A loose board above the bed looked one strong autumn gust away from landing on his face. He had just spent 500 gold on magical cards, while still sleeping inside a house that barely survived the weather. The contrast was ridiculous enough to make him laugh. Becoming stronger was no longer the only upgrade his life needed. With another tavern round secured and new enemies already moving, Lynn finally added one ordinary objective besides all the supernatural ones. It was time to give his family a home worthy of the future he was building.